Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Jake Morrison had been working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift in rural Blackwood County, Montana for 8 months, when dispatch began giving him instructions in the voice of his dead partner. A voice he recognized immediately because Officer Danny Chen had been killed in a car accident 3 weeks earlier. Yet here was Chen's unmistakable Boston accent crackling through the radio at 2:47 a.m. on November 3, 2023. Calmly directing Morrison to respond to a domestic disturbance call at an address that didn't exist on any map, in a town that had been abandoned since the 1960s, using procedures that Chen had never learned during his brief 6-month tenure with the department before his fatal collision with a drunk driver on Highway 14. Morrison's relationship with Chen had been complicated by the fact that he had been the training officer responsible for the younger man's field education, a role that had ended abruptly when Chen's patrol car was struck head-on by a pickup truck driven by a methamphetamine addict who had been fleeing from a domestic violence warrant. The accident had occurred during what should have been a routine traffic stop, transforming Morrison's guilt over his partner's death into a constant source of psychological torment that had already led to sleepless nights, increased alcohol consumption, and a growing reluctance to work alone during the overnight hours when the county's vast rural territory seemed to amplify every shadow and sound into potential threats. The Blackwood County Sheriff's Department covered over 1,200 square miles of Montana wilderness, with only 4 patrol officers working graveyard shifts, creating an environment where backup could be 30 minutes away, and radio communication was the only lifeline connecting isolated officers to help, supervision, and emergency medical services. Morrison had grown accustomed to spending entire shifts without seeing another human being, patrolling empty highways and abandoned ranch roads where the silence was so complete that the sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the patrol car's confined space. When Chen's voice emerged from the radio that November night, Morrison's first reaction was denial. Perhaps fatigue was causing auditory hallucinations, or maybe the radio was picking up old recordings from training exercises that had somehow been stored in the communication system's memory banks. However, the voice was undeniably Chen's, complete with his characteristic way of pronouncing certain words and his habit of adding unnecessary detail to routine communications that had often annoyed Morrison during their brief partnership. Unit 7. Respond to domestic disturbance at 1247 Timber Creek Road, Millfield Township, Chen's voice said with the same professional tone he had used during life, though Morrison knew that Millfield Township had been a ghost town for decades, and that no current address system included Timber Creek Road. Reports of screaming and possible assault in progress. Approach with caution and request backup if needed. Morrison attempted to respond to the dispatch, asking for clarification about the address and requesting verification of the call's origin, but his transmissions were met only with static and the occasional burst of electronic interference that suggested the radio system was experiencing technical difficulties. When he tried to contact the actual dispatch center using his cell phone, he discovered that his cellular service had no signal despite being in an area where coverage was normally reliable, leaving him completely isolated with only Chen's impossible voice providing guidance for responding to a call that couldn't exist. Following the directions provided by his dead partner's voice, Morrison found himself driving deeper into the mountainous backcountry along increasingly primitive roads that seemed to match Chen's geographic descriptions, despite not appearing on any official maps or GPS systems. The landscape around him became progressively more desolate and threatening, with abandoned structures and rusted machinery, suggesting that this area had once supported mining or logging operations that had been discontinued long before Morrison's assignment to Blackwood County. The roads themselves seemed wrong in ways that Morrison couldn't articulate. Too narrow, too winding, leading to destinations that felt familiar, despite his certainty that he had never been in this part of the county before. The patrol car's headlights revealed details about the surrounding terrain that suggested extensive human activity from previous decades, including collapsed buildings, overgrown equipment, and road signs that were too weathered to read, but which seemed to point toward communities that no longer existed. Chen's voice continued providing updates and directions throughout Morrison's journey into the abandoned territory, describing landmarks and geographic features with accuracy that would have been impossible for someone who had never visited these locations during life. The dead officer's knowledge of the area was comprehensive and detailed, including information about elevation changes, road conditions, and potential hazards that proved consistently accurate as Morrison navigated the increasingly challenging terrain. Turn left at the collapsed bridge marker, then proceed 2 miles to the junction with the old logging road. Chen's voice instructed with the same patient tone he had used when learning patrol procedures. The address will be on your right. White farmhouse with a green roof. Looks like there might be multiple subjects involved, so maintain situational awareness. The domestic disturbance call that Chen was directing Morrison to investigate became more disturbing as additional details emerged through the radio communications, with the dead officer describing sounds of violence, multiple voices shouting, and what sounded like furniture being thrown against walls or windows. Chen's updates suggested that the situation was escalating, and that immediate intervention might be necessary to prevent serious injury or death, creating pressure for Morrison to respond quickly, despite the impossibility of the circumstances. When Morrison finally located the white farmhouse with the green roof, exactly where Chen had indicated it would be, he found a structure that appeared to have been abandoned for decades, yet showed signs of recent activity that contradicted its obvious state of long-term neglect. Lights were visible in several windows, and the sounds of an argument could be heard coming from inside the building. Yet the surrounding yard was overgrown with vegetation, and the driveway was nearly impassable due to accumulated debris and fallen trees. Morrison's approach to the farmhouse was guided by Chen's continuing radio communications, with his dead partner providing tactical recommendations about positioning, escape routes, and potential dangers that proved remarkably prescient as the situation developed. Chen seemed to possess knowledge about the occupants of the house and the nature of their conflict that he couldn't have acquired through normal dispatch information, suggesting that his supernatural awareness extended beyond simple geographic knowledge to include real-time intelligence about current events. 3 subjects inside, 2 males and 1 female. Appears to be domestic violence situation with possible weapon involved. Chen reported with professional efficiency. Recommend standard domestic approach protocols. Be aware that the male suspects have history of violence against law enforcement. The domestic disturbance that Morrison encountered when he knocked on the farmhouse door was entirely real and required immediate intervention to prevent serious violence, but the family involved, a middle-aged couple and their adult son, claimed to have been living in the house for only a few weeks, despite its obvious abandonment, and their inability to explain how they had gained access to electricity or other utilities that should not have been available in such a remote and neglected location. The family members themselves seemed confused about their living situation and provided conflicting information about how long they had been residing in the farmhouse, where they had lived previously, and why they had chosen such an isolated and primitive location for their home. Their responses to Morrison's questions suggested disorientation and memory problems that might indicate drug use, mental illness, or some other factor that was affecting their perception of reality and their ability to provide coherent information about their circumstances. Most disturbing was the family's reaction to Morrison's presence, as they seemed genuinely surprised that a police officer had responded to their domestic dispute and claimed that they had not called for assistance or made any contact with law enforcement agencies. The woman showed signs of physical abuse and emotional distress, but when Morrison asked about the source of her injuries, she provided explanations that didn't match the physical evidence and seemed unable to remember specific details about recent events. Chen's voice continued providing guidance throughout Morrison's investigation of the domestic disturbance, offering tactical advice and suggesting interview techniques that proved effective for gathering information and de-escalating the potentially violent situation. The dead officer's recommendations were consistently helpful and appropriate, allowing Morrison to handle a complex domestic violence case with greater effectiveness than he might have achieved using only his own training and experience. However, Chen's supernatural assistance came with psychological costs that Morrison found increasingly difficult to manage as the night progressed. The constant presence of his dead partner's voice created a sense of unreality that made it difficult to distinguish between normal police work and the supernatural intervention that was somehow enabling him to respond to situations that shouldn't exist in locations that couldn't be reached through conventional navigation. The resolution of the domestic disturbance case required Morrison to coordinate with emergency medical services and social workers who somehow managed to locate the abandoned farmhouse despite its absence from official maps and its inaccessibility through normal transportation routes. The family was transported to appropriate facilities for medical treatment and crisis intervention, but Morrison was never able to obtain satisfactory explanations for how they had been living in an abandoned house or why his dead partner had possessed knowledge about their situation. When Morrison attempted to return to his normal patrol area, he discovered that the roads he had used to reach the farmhouse had apparently disappeared, leaving him stranded in wilderness terrain with no clear route back to civilization. Chen's voice provided directions for returning to the main highway system, but the route required Morrison to drive through areas that his GPS identified as impassable terrain, following roads that existed only in his dead partner's supernatural knowledge of the county's geography. The psychological aftermath of Morrison's supernatural domestic disturbance call included persistent questions about the reality of the events he had experienced and the nature of his dead partner's continuing involvement in police work. Chen's voice had been undeniably real and had provided valuable assistance for handling a genuine emergency situation, but the impossible circumstances of the call raised disturbing questions about the boundaries between life and death, and the possibility that Morrison's guilt over his partner's death was manifesting in ways that challenged his sanity and professional competence. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist specializing in law enforcement trauma, evaluated Morrison's mental health status after he reported his supernatural encounter with Chen's voice, but comprehensive assessment revealed no evidence of psychosis, substance abuse, or other mental health conditions that might explain auditory hallucinations or delusional thinking. Morrison's psychological profile indicated normal stress reactions to his partner's death and appropriate grief responses that didn't suggest pathological symptoms requiring psychiatric intervention. Morrison's attempts to investigate the farmhouse location during daylight hours proved futile, as he was unable to locate the property or identify any residents matching the description of the family he had assisted during the supernatural domestic disturbance call. The roads that Chen's voice had directed him to follow were not visible during daytime reconnaissance, and local residents had no knowledge of any domestic violence incidents or family situations that matched Morrison's descriptions of the events he had witnessed. The Blackwood County Sheriff's Department's investigation into Morrison's supernatural encounter revealed no official record of any domestic disturbance call being dispatched to his unit during the time period in question. And the communication system's digital recordings contained no evidence of Chen's voice or any other transmissions that corresponded to Morrison's reports of receiving supernatural guidance. However, the absence of official documentation didn't necessarily invalidate Morrison's experience, as the department's remote location and technical limitations created numerous opportunities for communication gaps and record-keeping failures. Sheriff Robert Daniels, after reviewing Morrison's report and consulting with technical specialists, classified the incident as a possible equipment malfunction combined with stress-related perceptual disturbances that didn't require disciplinary action, but warranted ongoing monitoring to ensure that Morrison remained capable of performing his duties safely and effectively. The official response acknowledged the reality of Morrison's experience while avoiding supernatural explanations that might compromise the department's credibility or Morrison's career prospects. Morrison continued working graveyard shifts in Blackwood County, though he requested assignment to patrol areas that were more accessible to backup and support services, reducing his exposure to the isolated territorial conditions that had contributed to his supernatural encounter with Chen's voice. His subsequent police work remained professional and effective, but colleagues noted that he seemed more cautious and deliberate in his decision-making, suggesting that his experience with supernatural assistance had fundamentally altered his approach to law enforcement. The ongoing mystery of Chen's posthumous involvement in Morrison's police work created lasting questions about the nature of partnership, responsibility, and guilt in law enforcement relationships. Morrison's experience suggested that the bonds between police officers might persist beyond death in ways that could provide assistance during dangerous situations, but which also created psychological burdens that challenged the survivor's ability to process grief and move forward with their careers. Today, Morrison works day shifts for a different sheriff's department in a more populated county where backup is readily available and radio communication is more reliable. He has never again received supernatural guidance from Chen's voice, though he continues to experience occasional technical difficulties with radio equipment that he attributes to normal equipment failures rather than paranormal intervention. His experience with supernatural assistance has made him a more empathetic and understanding supervisor for younger officers who face the psychological challenges of working alone during overnight hours in isolated rural territories. The Chen incident has become an unofficial part of Blackwood County Sheriff's Department lore, discussed quietly among graveyard shift officers who work the same isolated territories where Morrison encountered his dead partner's voice. While no other officers have reported similar supernatural experiences, the incident has created heightened awareness of the psychological pressures associated with rural overnight policing and the importance of providing adequate support for officers who work in conditions where backup might be unavailable, and communication failures can create dangerous isolation. For Morrison, the supernatural assistance he received from Chen's voice represents both a source of comfort and a continuing burden, as he struggles to understand whether his dead partner's intervention was real or the product of guilt and grief, manifesting during a moment of extreme stress and isolation. The ambiguity of the experience continues to affect his relationships with other officers and his approach to police work, creating a lasting reminder of the psychological costs associated with losing a partner and the complex ways that trauma can manifest in law enforcement careers. The legacy of Morrison's supernatural encounter has influenced training and support programs for rural police officers, emphasizing the importance of mental health resources and peer support systems that can help officers process the unique stresses associated with working alone in isolated territories where help might be hours away, and communication failures can create life-threatening situations. His experience has demonstrated that the psychological challenges of rural law enforcement can manifest in ways that challenge officers' perception of reality, while highlighting the importance of partnership and mutual support in maintaining officer safety and effectiveness. Officer Maria Santos had been working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift at the Riverside Police Department for 4 years, when the building began making sounds that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. Deep, guttural moaning that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, starting as barely audible whispers during her first week of November 2023, but gradually escalating into agonized wailing that could be heard throughout the entire station house during the darkest hours before dawn, creating an atmosphere of dread that made routine police work feel like a descent into something far more sinister than the normal challenges of law enforcement. The Riverside Police Department operated out of a converted Victorian mansion that had been built in 1887 as the private residence of railroad magnate Harrison Blackwood, whose family had lived in the imposing 3-story structure until 1952, when financial difficulties forced its sale to the city for conversion into municipal offices. The building's transformation into a police station had required extensive renovations to accommodate holding cells, evidence storage, communications equipment, and other law enforcement facilities. But much of the original architecture remained intact, including ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a grand staircase that dominated the central hallway. Santos had chosen the graveyard shift specifically because it offered higher pay and opportunities for overtime that helped support her 2 young children as a single mother. But the overnight hours in the converted mansion created an environment that felt more like a haunted house than a professional law enforcement facility. The building's age and architectural complexity created numerous acoustic anomalies. Creaking floorboards, settling timbers, and wind sounds that could be unsettling even for experienced officers who understood that old buildings naturally produced various noises during temperature changes and weather fluctuations. However, the sounds that began occurring during Santos's November shifts were qualitatively different from normal building acoustics, possessing an organic quality that suggested they were being produced by living creatures rather than settling wood or shifting foundations. The initial manifestations were subtle, brief sighs or whispers that could easily be dismissed as imagination or auditory pareidolia, the tendency for human perception to interpret random sounds as meaningful patterns or familiar voices. The escalation began during Santos's 3rd week of November, when the whispers evolved into more distinct vocalizations that seemed to carry emotional content suggesting pain, fear, and desperation. The sounds occurred most frequently between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., during the period when Santos was typically alone in the building, except for any prisoners in the holding cells and the occasional officer returning from patrol to complete paperwork or process arrests. The geographical distribution of the sounds suggested they were emanating from specific areas of the building rather than occurring randomly throughout the structure. The basement level, which housed evidence storage and old case files, seemed to be the primary source of the initial whispers, while the 2nd floor, where administrative offices were located, produced more intense vocalizations that sometimes resembled screaming or sobbing. Santos's attempts to locate the source of the sounds by conducting systematic searches of the building revealed no obvious explanations, no hidden spaces where animals might be trapped, no plumbing or ventilation systems that could produce such organic-sounding noises, and no evidence of intruders or unauthorized persons who might be responsible for the disturbing vocalizations. The sounds seemed to occur independently of any identifiable physical cause, appearing and disappearing without correlation to weather conditions, building occupancy, or any other environmental factors that Santos could observe. The psychological impact of working alone in a building that produced sounds resembling human suffering created significant stress for Santos, who found herself increasingly reluctant to enter certain areas of the station and developed habits of listening carefully before entering rooms or walking down hallways. The unpredictable nature of the sounds made it impossible to prepare mentally for their occurrence, creating a state of constant tension that affected her ability to focus on routine police work and respond effectively to radio communications and emergency calls. The situation became more disturbing when Santos realized that the sounds seemed to respond to her presence and activities, becoming more intense when she was alone and subsiding when other officers entered the building. This apparent correlation between her isolation and the manifestation of the vocalizations suggested that she was somehow the focus of whatever phenomenon was producing the sounds, creating additional psychological pressure and raising questions about whether her mental health or stress levels might be contributing to her perception of the auditory anomalies. Officer David Kim, who occasionally worked overlapping shifts with Santos, confirmed that he could also hear the strange sounds, particularly during the early morning hours when the building was nearly empty. Kim's corroboration eliminated the possibility that Santos was experiencing auditory hallucinations, but it also confirmed that the building was indeed producing sounds that had no apparent rational explanation and which created an atmosphere of unease that affected multiple officers. The sounds became significantly more disturbing during Santos's fourth week of November, when they began to include what sounded like distinctly human voices, speaking words that were almost but not quite comprehensible, as if the vocalizations were attempting to communicate specific information but were being distorted by some barrier that prevented clear understanding. The voices seemed to carry emotional urgency, suggesting that they were attempting to convey important messages, but the distortion made it impossible to determine what information they were trying to share. Santos began recording the sounds using her personal smartphone, hoping to gather evidence that might help identify their source or convince supervisors to investigate the acoustic anomalies that were affecting the working environment in the station house. The recordings captured clear evidence of the vocalizations, confirming their reality and ruling out the possibility that they were imaginary or the result of mental health issues, but audio analysis failed to provide any insights about their origin or mechanisms. The most disturbing development occurred when Santos realized that some of the distorted voices seemed to be speaking her name, calling Maria with increasing frequency and intensity during the hours when she was alone in the building. The personalized nature of these vocalizations transformed the general atmosphere of unease into a sense of direct threat that made Santos question whether she was somehow in danger from whatever force was producing the sounds. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, Santos's supervisor, conducted her own overnight observation of the building after Santos reported the escalating acoustic anomalies, and during her stay she witnessed vocalizations that she described as unlike anything I've ever heard in 20 years of police work. Martinez's official report documented the reality of the sounds, while acknowledging that their source remained unidentified despite thorough investigation of the building's physical systems and structural components. The investigation into the sounds expanded when building maintenance records revealed that similar acoustic anomalies had been reported sporadically by overnight staff since the building's conversion to police use. But previous reports had been dismissed as normal settling sounds, or attributed to the building's age and architectural complexity. The historical pattern of reports suggested that the sounds were a recurring phenomenon rather than a recent development, indicating that whatever was causing them had been present in the building for decades. Research into the building's history as the Blackwood family residence revealed several potentially relevant details, including the deaths of 3 family members who had died in the house under various circumstances. Harrison Blackwood's wife Eleanor had died of tuberculosis in 1903. Their son William had been killed in a hunting accident in 1918, and their daughter Catherine had died by suicide in 1931. While these historical deaths provided possible explanations for supernatural activity, they didn't necessarily account for the specific nature of the sounds, or their apparent focus on Santos as an individual. Dr. Robert Chen, an acoustics engineer consulted by the police department, conducted comprehensive analysis of the building's acoustic properties and concluded that while the structure did possess unusual resonance characteristics due to its age and construction materials, there was no conventional explanation for the types of vocalizations that Santos and other officers had reported experiencing. Dr. Chen's assessment confirmed that the sounds were real and were not the result of normal building acoustics or environmental factors. The psychological evaluation, conducted by Dr. Patricia Williams, revealed that Santos was experiencing normal stress reactions to an abnormal environment, but showed no signs of mental illness or psychological disorders that might explain auditory hallucinations or delusional thinking. Dr. Williams recommended that Santos be provided with appropriate support and possibly reassigned to different duties if the acoustic anomalies continued to affect her ability to work effectively in the station house environment. The most significant escalation occurred during Santos's final week of November, when the sounds began to include what appeared to be detailed descriptions of crimes that had occurred in the city, spoken in the distorted voices that seemed to emanate from within the building's walls. The vocalizations described specific incidents, locations, and suspect descriptions with accuracy that suggested access to official police information, but the details were being communicated through impossible means that challenged any rational explanation for how such information could be transmitted through building acoustics. The crime-related vocalizations proved to be accurate when verified against official police reports, confirming that the sounds were somehow conveying genuine intelligence about law enforcement matters rather than random or meaningless noise. This development transformed the acoustic anomalies from a simple annoyance into a potential security issue, as sensitive police information was apparently being accessed and broadcast through supernatural means that could compromise ongoing investigations and officer safety. Chief William Rodriguez made the decision to temporarily relocate overnight operations to a different facility, while the station house underwent comprehensive investigation by technical specialists, paranormal researchers, and structural engineers who attempted to identify the source of the vocalizations and determine whether they posed any safety risks to personnel working in the building. The temporary relocation eliminated Santos's exposure to the disturbing sounds, but didn't resolve the underlying mystery of their origin and purpose. The investigation team's findings were inconclusive, revealing no conventional explanations for the vocalizations while confirming their reality and documenting their unusual characteristics. The sounds continued to occur even when the building was completely empty, suggesting that they were not dependent on human presence and might represent some form of recorded phenomenon that was being replayed through unknown mechanisms within the building's structure. Santos requested reassignment to day shift duties rather than returning to overnight work in the station house, citing the psychological stress and safety concerns associated with working alone in an environment where supernatural phenomena could interfere with normal police operations. Her request was approved, and she successfully transitioned to daylight patrol duties that allowed her to continue her law enforcement career without exposure to the building's acoustic anomalies. The station house was eventually returned to normal operations after extensive modifications to the overnight staffing procedures that ensured multiple officers were present during the hours when the vocalizations were most likely to occur. These procedural changes reduced the psychological impact of the sounds on individual officers while maintaining the building's functionality as a police facility, though the acoustic anomalies continued to occur with regularity during late-night hours. Today, the Riverside Police Department acknowledges the station house's unusual acoustic properties in its orientation materials for new officers, preparing them for the possibility of hearing unexplained sounds, while emphasizing that these phenomena do not interfere with normal police operations when proper procedures are followed. The building continues to serve as an effective law enforcement facility despite its supernatural characteristics, demonstrating that police work can adapt to unusual environmental conditions when appropriate support and understanding are provided. Santos continues her law enforcement career with the same department, working day shifts where she has earned recognition for her professional competence and dedication to community service. Her experience with the station house sounds has made her more understanding of officers who report unusual phenomena during overnight duties, and she serves as an informal counselor for colleagues who struggle with the psychological challenges of working in environments where conventional explanations may not account for all observed phenomena. The mystery of the station house vocalizations remains unsolved, but the department has developed effective protocols for managing the situation that balance acknowledgement of the phenomenon's reality with maintenance of professional law enforcement standards. The building's supernatural characteristics have become an accepted part of working for the Riverside Police Department, demonstrating that modern policing can incorporate unusual elements while maintaining focus on public safety and community service objectives. The legacy of Santos's experience has influenced policy development for law enforcement agencies that operate in older buildings or facilities with histories that might contribute to unusual environmental conditions. Her case has demonstrated that supernatural phenomena can affect police work in ways that require acknowledgement and accommodation rather than denial or dismissal, creating precedents for managing unusual workplace conditions while maintaining professional effectiveness and officer well-being. For Santos, the transition from graveyard shift work in a supernatural environment to normal day shift duties has allowed her to continue serving her community while avoiding the psychological stress associated with unexplained phenomena that challenged her understanding of reality and professional competence. Her experience has contributed to improved support systems for officers who encounter unusual situations that fall outside normal training and preparation, ensuring that law enforcement personnel receive appropriate assistance when their work exposes them to circumstances that exceed conventional explanation. Officer Janet Walsh had been working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift in Millfield County, Nebraska, for 2 years, when the GPS in her patrol car began directing her to locations where horrific crimes were occurring exactly as she arrived. Murders, assaults, and disappearances that seemed to be perfectly timed to her presence, as if someone or something was orchestrating these violent events specifically for her to witness during the darkest hours of night when backup was 30 minutes away, and radio communication was unreliable in the vast rural territory she patrolled alone. What started as a disturbing coincidence on October 23, 2022, gradually revealed itself as something far more sinister that challenged Walsh's sanity, and left her questioning whether she was being used as an unwilling participant in a supernatural conspiracy that transformed her protective duties into something resembling complicity in unspeakable violence. Millfield County encompassed over 900 square miles of agricultural land, small towns, and isolated farmsteads scattered across rolling prairie terrain that created natural blind spots and communication dead zones where a patrol officer could disappear for hours without anyone noticing their absence. Walsh's assignment to the graveyard shift reflected the department's chronic understaffing, but her military background and experience with high-stress situations made her well-suited for the independence and decision-making responsibilities that came with patrolling alone across territories where the nearest backup might be responding from the opposite end of the county. The county's aging GPS system had been installed 3 years earlier, as part of a federal grant program designed to improve rural law enforcement efficiency, but technical problems and budget constraints had prevented proper maintenance and updates that would have ensured reliable operation under all conditions. Walsh had grown accustomed to occasional navigation errors and system glitches that directed her to incorrect addresses or provided outdated routing information, minor inconveniences that she compensated for through her knowledge of local geography and her habit of double-checking important calls through radio communication with dispatch. The first incident that would establish the horrifying pattern occurred during Walsh's routine patrol along County Road 47, when her GPS suddenly activated without any input from her and began providing turn-by-turn directions to a farmhouse located approximately 12 miles northeast of her current position. The device's screen showed an emergency symbol indicating an active crime in progress, but Walsh had received no dispatch call or radio communication authorizing her to respond to any situation in that area. Her attempts to contact dispatch for clarification met with static and interference that suggested technical problems with the radio system. Following the GPS directions, despite her unease about the lack of official authorization, Walsh arrived at the farmhouse just as a domestic violence situation was escalating into attempted murder, with an armed male suspect attacking his estranged wife with a kitchen knife while their 2 young children screamed in terror from an upstairs bedroom. The timing of her arrival was impossibly precise. She entered the house just as the suspect raised the knife for what would have been a fatal blow, allowing her to intervene and prevent a triple homicide that would have devastated a family and traumatized the rural community. The successful intervention should have been a career highlight that demonstrated the value of proactive policing and quick response times. But something about the circumstances felt wrong in ways that Walsh couldn't articulate, despite her extensive training and experience with domestic violence calls. The suspect seemed genuinely surprised by her arrival, as if he had been expecting privacy for his violent acts, and the victims appeared relieved but confused about how she had known to respond to a situation that they claimed they had not reported to authorities. Investigation of the incident revealed that no emergency calls had been made from the farmhouse. No neighbors had reported disturbances, and the GPS system showed no record of generating the navigation instructions that had directed Walsh to the location. The domestic violence call had somehow been prevented through her intervention, but there was no explanation for how she had gained knowledge of the situation or why her patrol car's navigation system had activated independently to guide her to the scene. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later, when Walsh's GPS again activated without authorization and directed her to an abandoned grain elevator on the outskirts of Millfield Township, where she discovered a kidnapping in progress, as 2 armed men were preparing to execute a teenage girl they had been holding for ransom. Her arrival interrupted the execution just as one of the suspects was placing a gun against the victim's head, and her immediate tactical response resulted in the arrest of both kidnappers and the safe rescue of the victim who had been missing for 6 days. Again, the timing was impossibly precise, and the circumstances raised disturbing questions about how Walsh had gained knowledge of the kidnapping location when federal investigators and state police had been searching unsuccessfully for the victim using extensive resources and advanced investigative techniques. The GPS system showed no record of the navigation instructions, and dispatch had no record of authorizing Walsh to respond to the abandoned grain elevator where the rescue had occurred. The pattern continued with increasingly frequency and precision, as Walsh's GPS began directing her to violent crimes in progress on a weekly basis, always with perfect timing that allowed her to prevent murders, rapes, and other serious felonies that would have gone undetected in the rural territory where such crimes could be committed and concealed with relative ease. Each successful intervention saved lives and resulted in the arrest of dangerous criminals, but the impossible accuracy of the GPS directions and the complete absence of any logical explanation for how she was gaining intelligence about crimes in progress created growing anxiety about her role in events that seemed orchestrated by forces beyond her understanding. Walsh's attempts to discuss the pattern with her supervisor, Sergeant Robert Martinez, were met with skepticism and suggestions that she was simply developing exceptional instincts for detecting criminal activity through subtle environmental cues and improved familiarity with the patrol territory. Martinez attributed her success rate to good police work rather than supernatural intervention, but he privately began monitoring her patrol activities more closely after receiving reports from other officers who had noticed the unusual frequency of her emergency responses. The psychological impact of witnessing violent crimes in progress on a regular basis began to affect Walsh's mental health and personal relationships as she struggled to process the constant exposure to human brutality and the disturbing knowledge that without her inexplicable interventions, numerous innocent people would have been murdered, raped, or tortured by criminals who seemed to be operating with the confidence that their crimes would go undetected in the isolated rural territory. More troubling was Walsh's growing realization that the GPS directions were not random, but appeared to be guided by an intelligence that understood criminal patterns and victim vulnerability in ways that suggested long-term observation and planning. The crimes she interrupted were not impulsive acts of violence, but carefully planned attacks that had been in preparation for days or weeks. Yet her GPS somehow possessed advanced knowledge of when and where these crimes would occur. The most disturbing incident occurred when Walsh's GPS directed her to a location where no crime was in progress, but where she discovered evidence of recent violence that led to the discovery of a serial killer's burial ground containing the remains of 14 victims who had disappeared over the past 5 years. The GPS had guided her to a specific location in a vast cornfield where she found disturbed earth that would never have been noticed during normal patrol activities, suggesting that whatever intelligence was controlling her navigation system possessed knowledge about crimes that had already been committed, as well as those that were about to occur. The discovery of the burial ground triggered a massive investigation involving federal authorities and multiple law enforcement agencies. But Walsh found herself unable to explain how she had known where to look for evidence that had eluded professional investigators for years. The GPS system showed no record of providing directions to the cornfield, and Walsh's explanation that she had been following navigation instructions from her patrol car was met with confusion and skepticism from investigators who could find no technical evidence to support her claims. Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Walsh's mental health status, found no evidence of psychological disorders that might explain delusions or hallucinations, but her assessment revealed significant stress indicators and anxiety symptoms consistent with someone experiencing repeated trauma from exposure to violent crimes. Dr. Chen's recommendation for psychological support and possible reassignment to less stressful duties was complicated by Walsh's exceptional performance record and her apparent ability to prevent serious crimes through means that defied rational explanation. Walsh's request for transfer to day shift duties was denied due to staffing shortages, but the department installed a backup GPS system in her patrol car and assigned her a partner for high-risk calls in an attempt to provide additional verification for her reports and reduce the psychological pressure of working alone during encounters with violent criminals. However, the presence of a partner seemed to interfere with the GPS system's mysterious operation, and the navigation instructions ceased when Walsh was not alone in the patrol car. The cessation of GPS directions when she worked with a partner confirmed Walsh's suspicion that whatever intelligence was controlling her patrol route required her to be alone and vulnerable during her encounters with violent crimes. This realization transformed her. The technical specifications of her GPS system revealed that the device had been refurbished using components from various sources, including parts that had been salvaged from patrol cars involved in fatal accidents where officers had died in the line of duty. The possibility that her navigation system contained elements from vehicles where officers had been killed created disturbing questions about whether the mysterious intelligence guiding her patrol route might be connected to the deaths of her colleagues and the lingering trauma associated with police vehicles that had been witness to violence and tragedy. The final incident that led to Walsh's departure from the Millfield County Sheriff's Department occurred when her GPS directed her to a location where she discovered her own supervisor, Sergeant Martinez, in the process of committing a violent assault against a woman he had been stalking for months. The impossibly precise timing placed Walsh in the position of witnessing her supervisor's criminal activity and being forced to arrest the man who had been evaluating her mental health and questioning the reality of her supernatural experiences. Martinez's arrest and subsequent investigation revealed that he had been using his position to identify vulnerable victims and had been responsible for several unsolved assaults in the county, crimes that had gone undetected because his authority allowed him to misdirect investigations and suppress evidence. The GPS system's guidance had finally exposed a predator within the law enforcement community, but the personal betrayal and professional complications created by arresting her own supervisor pushed Walsh beyond her psychological breaking point. Walsh submitted her resignation from the sheriff's department immediately after Martinez's arrest, citing the impossibility of continuing to work in an environment where she couldn't trust her colleagues, and where supernatural forces seemed to be manipulating her patrol duties for purposes she couldn't understand or control. Her departure represented the loss of an officer with an exceptional record for preventing violent crimes, but her mental health and personal safety required removing herself from circumstances that had transformed her protective duties into a form of psychological torture. The GPS system was removed from service and subjected to extensive technical analysis that revealed no conventional explanations for its apparent ability to provide directions to crime scenes before those crimes had been reported to authorities. The device was eventually destroyed rather than risk its installation in another patrol car, where it might subject a different officer to the same psychological ordeal that had driven Walsh from law enforcement. Today, Walsh works as a private security consultant in a different state, having relocated to escape the memories and trauma associated with her supernatural patrol experiences in Millfield County. Her case has become a cautionary example within rural law enforcement about the psychological dangers of isolated patrol work and the importance of providing adequate support for officers who encounter unexplained phenomena during their duties. The Millfield County Sheriff's Department has implemented new policies requiring officers to work in pairs during graveyard shifts whenever possible, and all patrol vehicles are equipped with backup communication systems to prevent the kind of isolation that contributed to Walsh's psychological ordeal. While these measures have improved officer safety and reduced the stress associated with rural patrol work, they have also resulted in an increase in violent crimes that go undetected until after the fact, suggesting that Walsh's supernatural guidance, despite its psychological costs, had been preventing numerous tragedies that now occur without intervention. The mystery of how Walsh's GPS system gained knowledge of crimes in progress remains unsolved, but her experience has contributed to growing awareness within law enforcement that some phenomena exceed rational explanation while requiring careful management to protect officer well-being. Her legacy serves as a reminder that the supernatural enhancement of police capabilities may come with psychological costs that outweigh the benefits, and that officers who encounter such phenomena deserve support and understanding rather than skepticism and dismissal. For Walsh, the transition away from law enforcement has allowed her to rebuild her life without the constant exposure to violence and the psychological pressure of supernatural manipulation that had transformed her commitment to protecting others into a source of personal trauma. Her experience demonstrates that some mysteries are too dangerous to investigate, and that the boundary between helpful and harmful supernatural intervention may be thinner than those who encounter such phenomena initially realize. Officer Tommy Brennan had been working the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift in rural Millbrook County, Kansas for 18 months when he began receiving emergency calls that led him to crime scenes where the victims had been dead for years. Perfectly preserved bodies discovered in situations that suggested recent violence, with evidence that appeared fresh despite forensic analysis revealing that the deaths had occurred decades earlier, creating impossible scenarios where Brennan found himself investigating murders that had happened before he was born, while following dispatch instructions that directed him to locations where time seemed to function according to different rules than those governing the normal world of law enforcement. Millbrook County encompassed nearly 800 square miles of agricultural land and small rural communities, with a population of fewer than 12,000 residents spread across an area that required extensive patrol coverage during overnight hours when most businesses were closed and emergency services operated with minimal staffing. Brennan's assignment to the graveyard shift reflected his status as one of the department's newest officers, but his military background and technical training made him well suited for the independence and decision-making responsibilities that came with patrolling alone across vast territories where backup might be 30 minutes away. The county's emergency dispatch system served multiple law enforcement agencies and emergency services across the region, coordinating responses to calls that ranged from medical emergencies and traffic accidents to domestic disturbances and property crimes. The overnight dispatcher, Janet Morrison, had been working the graveyard shift for 12 years and was known for her professional competence and ability to manage complex situations with multiple agencies and competing priorities during the overnight hours when staffing levels were reduced across all emergency services. Brennan's first anomalous call came during his shift on March 15, 2024, when Morrison dispatched him to investigate a reported homicide at a farmhouse on County Road 47, approximately 20 miles northeast of the county seat. The call had come from an anonymous tip reporting gunshots and screaming at the isolated property, followed by suspicious vehicle activity that suggested the perpetrators might still be in the area and potentially dangerous to responding officers. The drive to County Road 47 took Brennan through rural territory that he had patrolled regularly during his 18 months with the department, following familiar routes past landmarks that he recognized from previous calls and routine patrol activities. However, as he approached the reported address, the landscape began to seem subtly different in ways that he couldn't immediately identify. Buildings that appeared newer or older than he remembered, road signs that seemed to indicate different distances to nearby towns, and agricultural patterns that didn't match his recollection of the area's typical farming activities. The farmhouse where the homicide had allegedly occurred was located at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by well-maintained fields and outbuildings that suggested an active farming operation. Though Brennan couldn't recall ever seeing the property during his previous patrols through this section of the county. The house itself appeared to be from the 1940s or 1950s, constructed in the simple architectural style typical of rural Kansas farming communities, with a front porch and detached garage that showed signs of recent maintenance and regular use. Brennan's approach to the property followed standard procedures for potentially dangerous situations, including calling for backup and requesting that Morrison coordinate with neighboring law enforcement agencies to ensure adequate support was available if the situation escalated. However, his radio communications began experiencing static and interference as he neared the farmhouse, making it difficult to maintain clear contact with dispatch and increasing his sense of isolation and vulnerability. The front door of the farmhouse was standing open when Brennan arrived, revealing a darkened interior that showed no signs of current occupancy despite the property's well-maintained appearance. Following protocols for investigating reported homicides, Brennan announced his presence and called for any occupants to respond before entering the building with his service weapon drawn and his flashlight providing illumination for the darkened rooms. The scene that Brennan discovered inside the farmhouse was unlike anything in his previous law enforcement experience or military training. The living room contained the bodies of what appeared to be a family, 2 adults and 3 children, arranged in positions that suggested they had been shot while watching television, with bullet wounds that appeared fresh and blood patterns that seemed to indicate recent violence. However, the television itself was a model from the 1960s, and the family's clothing and hairstyles also appeared to be from several decades earlier, creating a temporal disconnect that Brennan initially attributed to isolated rural communities where older styles and equipment might persist longer than in urban areas. The physical evidence at the scene included spent shell casings, blood spatter patterns, and other forensic materials that appeared consistent with a recent multiple homicide. But the overall environment of the house suggested that it had been abandoned for many years despite the apparent freshness of the crime scene. Dust patterns, insect activity, and deterioration of perishable items indicated that the house had been unoccupied for an extended period. Yet the victims appeared to have been killed within hours of Brennan's arrival. Brennan's investigation of the crime scene was complicated by continuing radio interference that prevented clear communication with dispatch or backup units, leaving him isolated in a potentially dangerous situation where the perpetrators might still be in the area. His attempts to contact Morrison using his cell phone revealed that he had no cellular service despite being in an area where coverage was normally reliable, increasing his sense of vulnerability and raising questions about whether he was dealing with more than a simple homicide investigation. The forensic evidence at the scene included fingerprints, DNA samples, and other materials that Brennan collected according to standard procedures. But his photography of the crime scene revealed anomalies that challenged his understanding of the situation. Digital images showed the victims and evidence clearly, but also captured details that suggested the house was simultaneously occupied and abandoned, with furniture that appeared both new and deteriorated, technology that seemed to span multiple decades, and environmental conditions that defied logical explanation. As Brennan continued his investigation, he discovered additional evidence that suggested the homicide had occurred during a home invasion robbery, with valuables missing and signs of forced entry that indicated the perpetrators had broken into the house seeking money or other portable assets. However, the stolen items appeared to be from the same historical period as the victims' clothing and the house's furnishings, including old currency, vintage jewelry, and antique electronics that would have little value to contemporary criminals. The most disturbing aspect of Brennan's investigation was the gradual realization that he was documenting a crime scene that felt both completely real and utterly impossible, with physical evidence that appeared genuine but which couldn't logically exist in the temporal and geographical context where he had discovered it. The victims were clearly dead, the forensic evidence was consistent with violent crime, and the scene required professional law enforcement response, yet the circumstances challenged every assumption about how reality functioned and what was possible within normal police work. Brennan's attempts to leave the crime scene and return to normal patrol duties were frustrated by navigation difficulties that seemed to trap him in the immediate area around the farmhouse, with roads that led in circles or dead-ended at locations that didn't match his knowledge of the county's geography. His GPS system malfunctioned repeatedly, providing directions to destinations that didn't exist, or routing him to the same location regardless of the coordinates he entered, creating a sense of spatial disorientation that compounded his growing anxiety about the situation. When Brennan finally managed to re-establish radio contact with Morrison, the dispatcher had no record of sending him to investigate a homicide on County Road 47, and her computer system showed no emergency calls from that area during his shift. Morrison's confusion about the assignment that had led Brennan to the farmhouse raised questions about how he had received the initial dispatch, and whether he was experiencing some form of psychological breakdown that was affecting his perception of reality and his ability to distinguish between actual emergency calls and hallucinated communications. The investigation into Brennan's reported homicide scene was complicated by the fact that when backup units and supervisors attempted to locate the farmhouse where he claimed to have discovered multiple victims, they found only an empty field with no buildings or structures that matched his descriptions. The property records for County Road 47 showed no current or historical buildings at the coordinates where Brennan insisted he had conducted his investigation, creating official doubt about the reality of his experience and raising concerns about his mental health and fitness for duty. However, the forensic evidence that Brennan had collected at the impossible crime scene proved to be genuine when analyzed by the State Crime Laboratory, with DNA samples, fingerprints, and ballistics evidence that matched multiple unsolved homicide cases from the 1960s and 1970s. The physical evidence confirmed that Brennan had indeed investigated a real crime scene, but one that had occurred decades earlier, and in circumstances that defied rational explanation for how he had gained access to materials from historical cases. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist consulted by the Sheriff's Department, evaluated Brennan's mental health status and found no evidence of psychosis, substance abuse, or other psychological conditions that might explain hallucinations or delusional thinking. Brennan's psychological profile indicated normal stress reactions to an extraordinary situation, but showed no signs of mental illness that would compromise his ability to function effectively as a law enforcement officer. The Sheriff's Department's internal investigation concluded that Brennan had experienced some form of temporal anomaly that had allowed him to access and investigate crime scenes from previous decades, though the mechanisms underlying such experiences remained completely unknown and challenged conventional understanding of time, space, and criminal investigation. The official response acknowledged the reality of Brennan's experience while avoiding supernatural explanations that might compromise the department's credibility. Brennan continued working graveyard shifts in Millbrook County, though he requested assignment to patrol areas closer to town where backup was more readily available and communication systems were more reliable. His subsequent police work remained professional and effective, but colleagues noted that he seemed more cautious and methodical in his approach to emergency calls, suggesting that his experience with temporal crime scenes had fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible during routine law enforcement activities. The forensic evidence from Brennan's impossible homicide investigation was used to reopen and eventually solve several cold cases from the 1960s and 1970s, providing closure for families who had waited decades for answers about their loved ones' deaths. The resolution of these historical cases validated the reality of Brennan's experience while creating new questions about the nature of time and the possibility that unsolved crimes might somehow persist in ways that allowed contemporary investigators to access evidence from the past. The psychological impact of investigating crime scenes that existed outside normal temporal boundaries created lasting stress for Brennan, who found himself questioning the nature of reality and his ability to trust his own perceptions during routine police work. The knowledge that he might encounter additional temporal anomalies during future emergency calls created anxiety that affected his sleep patterns, decision-making processes, and relationships with colleagues who had not experienced similar phenomena. Sheriff Patricia Williams, after consulting with state law enforcement agencies and federal authorities, classified Brennan's temporal crime scene experience as an unexplained incident that required ongoing monitoring, but didn't necessarily indicate any threat to public safety or law enforcement operations. The official position acknowledged that some aspects of police work might involve phenomena that exceeded current scientific understanding while maintaining focus on conventional law enforcement objectives. Brennan's second encounter with temporal crime scenes occurred 6 weeks after his initial experience, when Morrison dispatched him to investigate a reported bank robbery at First National Bank in downtown Millbrook, despite the fact that the building had been demolished in 1987 to make way for a modern shopping center. The dispatch call included specific details about armed suspects, hostages, and ongoing criminal activity that required immediate law enforcement response. But the location of the reported crime was a parking lot that had replaced the original bank building decades earlier. Following Morrison's directions, Brennan found himself approaching what appeared to be a fully operational bank building that matched historical photographs of First National Bank from the 1970s, complete with period-appropriate signage, architecture, and environmental details that suggested he was experiencing another temporal displacement that had transported him to a crime scene from several decades in the past. The bank robbery was in progress when he arrived, with armed suspects holding hostages and demanding money from tellers who appeared to be dressed in clothing and hairstyles from the 1970s. The tactical situation required Brennan to coordinate with backup units and specialized response teams to resolve the hostage situation safely, but his radio communications were again affected by static and interference that prevented clear contact with contemporary emergency services. The suspect's weapons, vehicles, and criminal techniques appeared to be from the same historical period as the bank building and its employees, creating a temporally consistent environment that nevertheless existed impossibly in the present day. Brennan's resolution of the bank robbery followed standard law enforcement procedures for hostage situations, resulting in the apprehension of the suspects and the safe release of all hostages without injury or loss of life. However, when backup units arrived at the scene, they found only the modern shopping center that had replaced the bank building, with no evidence of criminal activity or any indication that a robbery had occurred at that location. The suspects that Brennan had arrested during the temporal bank robbery were documented through booking procedures that appeared normal in all respects, but background checks revealed that they were individuals who had died in prison during the 1980s while serving sentences for bank robberies that matched the crimes Brennan had interrupted. The arrested suspects possessed identification and personal effects from the 1970s, including currency that was no longer in circulation and credit cards that had been issued by banks that no longer existed. Dr. Elizabeth Park, a temporal physicist consulted by federal authorities investigating Brennan's unusual experiences, theorized that certain geographic locations might possess properties that allowed access to past events under specific conditions that were not yet understood by conventional science. Dr. Park's research suggested that Brennan might have encountered temporal echoes, where traumatic or significant events had somehow imprinted themselves on local space-time and could be accessed by individuals with particular sensitivity or under appropriate environmental circumstances. The federal investigation into Brennan's temporal crime scene experiences revealed that similar incidents had been reported sporadically by law enforcement officers across the country, though most such reports had been dismissed as hallucinations or stress-related psychological phenomena. The accumulation of consistent reports from credible officers suggested that temporal displacement might be a rare but genuine phenomenon that affected a small number of individuals who worked in law enforcement during overnight hours, when normal environmental conditions were altered by factors that remained unknown. Brennan's third temporal crime scene occurred during his investigation of a reported multiple homicide at the abandoned Millbrook Elementary School, which had been closed since 1995, but appeared to be fully operational and occupied by students and staff when he responded to the emergency call. The school shooting was in progress when he arrived, with an active shooter moving through classrooms and targeting children and teachers in a rampage that required immediate intervention to prevent additional casualties. The tactical response to the school shooting required Brennan to enter the building alone and attempt to locate and neutralize the shooter before additional victims were killed or wounded. The school's interior appeared to be from the 1980s, with period-appropriate decorations, technology, and educational materials that suggested the shooting was occurring during that historical period rather than in the present day. Brennan's successful intervention in the school shooting resulted in the apprehension of the shooter and the prevention of additional casualties, but his actions were complicated by the knowledge that he was operating in a temporal environment where the consequences of his decisions might affect events that had already occurred in the past. The shooter was the individual who had actually committed a similar crime at Millbrook Elementary School in 1983, resulting in multiple deaths that had traumatized the community for decades. The resolution of the temporal school shooting provided Brennan with an opportunity to prevent a historical tragedy that had caused immense suffering for the families of victims and the broader Millbrook community. But the moral and ethical implications of altering past events raised complex questions about the responsibilities of law enforcement officers who gained access to temporal crime scenes. The successful intervention resulted in lives being saved that had been lost in the original historical incident, but created paradoxes about the nature of time and causality that challenged conventional understanding of police work. The psychological evaluation conducted after Brennan's third temporal experience revealed increasing stress and anxiety related to his supernatural law enforcement duties, with symptoms suggesting that repeated exposure to temporal crime scenes was creating mental health challenges that required professional intervention and support. Dr. Rodriguez recommended that Brennan be provided with specialized counseling and possibly reassigned to duties that were less likely to involve temporal anomalies. Sheriff Williams, in consultation with federal authorities and mental health specialists, made the decision to transfer Brennan to administrative duties that would reduce his exposure to potential temporal crime scenes, while allowing him to continue his law enforcement career in a capacity that utilized his experience with unusual phenomena. The reassignment acknowledged that Brennan's temporal experiences were real and valuable, but required management to protect his psychological well-being and professional effectiveness. Brennan's transition to administrative duties included responsibilities for training other officers about unusual phenomena that might be encountered during law enforcement work, developing protocols for responding to supernatural or temporal incidents, and serving as a consultant for cases that involved unexplained elements that challenged conventional investigative methods. His experience with temporal crime scenes provided valuable insights for preparing other officers to handle extraordinary situations while maintaining professional standards and psychological resilience. The cold cases that were solved using evidence from Brennan's temporal crime scene investigations resulted in closure for dozens of families who had waited decades for answers about unsolved murders, robberies, and other violent crimes. The physical evidence that Brennan had collected from impossible crime scenes proved to be authentic and valuable for resolving historical cases, demonstrating that temporal anomalies could serve legitimate law enforcement purposes despite their supernatural nature. Today, Brennan works as a training coordinator for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, developing educational programs that prepare law enforcement officers for unusual situations that might challenge their understanding of reality while maintaining focus on professional effectiveness and public safety. His experience with temporal crime scenes has made him a valuable resource for officers who encounter phenomena that exceed conventional explanation and require special approaches to investigation and resolution. The Millbrook County Sheriff's Department has quietly established protocols for managing officers who report temporal anomalies or other supernatural experiences during their duties, creating support systems that acknowledge the reality of such phenomena while providing appropriate mental health resources and career guidance. These protocols recognize that modern law enforcement sometimes involves encounters with unexplained phenomena that require understanding and accommodation rather than dismissal or denial. Brennan's legacy in law enforcement includes the development of investigative techniques that can be applied to both conventional and temporal crime scenes, training programs that prepare officers for extraordinary situations, and support systems that help law enforcement personnel process experiences that challenge their understanding of reality. His successful integration of temporal experiences with professional police work has demonstrated that supernatural phenomena can be managed effectively within law enforcement frameworks when appropriate resources and understanding are provided. The ongoing mystery of how and why Brennan gained access to temporal crime scenes remains unsolved, but his experiences have contributed to growing recognition that law enforcement work sometimes involves phenomena that exceed conventional scientific explanation while requiring the same professional standards and ethical conduct that define all legitimate police activities. His temporal investigations have provided closure for historical cases while establishing precedents for managing extraordinary circumstances that challenge normal understanding of police work. For Brennan, the transition from active patrol duties to administrative and training responsibilities has allowed him to continue serving law enforcement while avoiding the psychological stress and uncertainty associated with temporal crime scene investigations. His experience has demonstrated that officers who encounter supernatural phenomena can continue productive careers when provided with appropriate support, understanding, and alternative assignments that utilize their unique experience while protecting their mental health and professional effectiveness. The temporal crime scenes that Brennan investigated have been sealed and classified by federal authorities, but the evidence and insights gained from these impossible investigations continue to influence cold case resolution and training programs that prepare law enforcement officers for the full spectrum of challenges they might encounter during their careers. His experience has shown that the boundaries between past and present, possible and impossible, may be more fluid than conventional understanding suggests, particularly in the realm of law enforcement, where officers sometimes encounter phenomena that defy explanation but require professional response nonetheless. Officer Mark Stevens had been working the overnight shift at the Riverside Police Department's evidence facility for 6 months when the stored items began reenacting the crimes they had been collected from. Blood-stained clothing that moved as if worn by invisible bodies, weapons that fired themselves in precise patterns that matched their original violent use, and personal effects that replayed the final moments of their owners' lives with horrifying accuracy during the dead hours between midnight and dawn, when Stevens was alone with thousands of pieces of evidence from decades of unsolved murders, rapes, and disappearances. What began as subtle movements and unexplained sounds on January 11, 2023, escalated into full supernatural recreations of violent crimes that forced Stevens to witness the brutal deaths of countless victims, while being unable to help them or stop the endless cycle of violence that transformed the evidence facility into a theater of horrors where the past refused to remain buried. The Riverside Police Department's evidence facility was housed in a converted warehouse that had been originally built in the 1940s as a storage facility for military supplies during World War II, but had been repurposed for law enforcement use in the 1970s, when the department's growing caseload required more space for storing physical evidence from criminal investigations. The building's concrete construction and temperature-controlled environment made it ideal for preserving evidence, but its isolated location and minimal overnight staffing created an atmosphere that even experienced officers found unsettling during the quiet hours when most of the city was asleep, and the facility's contents represented the accumulated violence of generations. Stevens's assignment to the evidence facility reflected his status as one of the department's newest officers, but his background in warehouse management and inventory control made him well-suited for the organizational challenges of maintaining thousands of evidence items in proper storage conditions while ensuring chain-of-custody requirements and providing access for investigators and attorneys who needed specific materials for ongoing cases and court proceedings. The overnight shift involved routine security checks, climate monitoring, and processing new evidence deliveries from day shift officers who had completed their investigations and needed to transfer materials to secure storage. The facility contained evidence from cases dating back to the 1960s, including numerous unsolved murders and violent crimes that had generated extensive physical evidence, but had never been successfully prosecuted due to lack of witnesses, insufficient investigative resources, or technical limitations that had prevented effective analysis of complex forensic materials. The older evidence sections contained items that predated modern forensic techniques, and represented hundreds of victims whose killers had never been identified or brought to justice, creating an atmosphere of unresolved tragedy that seemed to permeate the building's institutional environment. Stevens's first encounter with supernatural activity occurred during a routine security check of a Section C, which housed evidence from homicide investigations dating from the 1980s and 1990s, when he noticed that several evidence boxes had been moved from their assigned storage locations despite the facility's strict access controls and surveillance systems that should have documented any unauthorized handling of stored materials. The displaced boxes contained clothing, weapons, and personal effects from various murder cases, but there was no indication of how they had been moved or why they had been rearranged in specific patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. Investigation of the surveillance footage revealed no evidence of human intrusion or technical malfunction that might explain the movement of evidence boxes, but careful review of the recordings showed subtle visual anomalies, brief shadows that didn't correspond to any physical objects, temperature variations that caused condensation patterns on metal surfaces, and electromagnetic interference that created distortions in the video quality during specific time periods when the evidence movement had apparently occurred. The second incident involved evidence from a particularly brutal murder case from 1987, when Stevens discovered that a blood-stained dress from the victim had somehow become saturated with fresh blood, despite having been dried and properly preserved for over 30 years in secure storage conditions. The dress appeared to be worn by an invisible body that was moving through the storage area, leaving bloody footprints and handprints on surfaces throughout Section C, while reenacting what appeared to be the victim's final moments before her death. Stevens's attempts to document the supernatural activity using his cell phone camera resulted in footage that captured the blood trail and evidence of invisible movement, but failed to show any human figures or identifiable sources for the paranormal phenomena. The recordings provided proof that something extraordinary was occurring in the evidence facility, but offered no explanations for the mechanisms behind the supernatural reenactments or guidance for how to respond to situations that fell outside normal law enforcement protocols. The pattern escalated rapidly as more evidence items began exhibiting supernatural activity during Stevens's overnight shifts, with weapons discharging in patterns that matched their original criminal use, personal jewelry moving as if worn by invisible victims, and DNA samples spontaneously reorganizing themselves in ways that spelled out names, dates, and locations related to unsolved crimes. The evidence facility became a supernatural crime scene, where past violence was being replayed continuously, forcing Stevens to witness hundreds of murders, assaults, and other violent crimes that had occurred throughout the department's history. The psychological impact of witnessing supernatural reenactments of violent crimes on a nightly basis created severe mental health challenges for Stevens, who found himself unable to sleep during off-duty hours due to intrusive memories of the horrific scenes he had been forced to observe. The constant exposure to violence, even in supernatural form, triggered symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, anxiety attacks, and difficulty maintaining normal social relationships due to his preoccupation with the endless cycle of violence he encountered at work. More disturbing was Stevens's realization that the supernatural reenactments were not random replays of past events, but seemed to be attempts by the victims to communicate information about their deaths that had not been discovered during the original investigations. The invisible figures moved in patterns that pointed toward specific pieces of evidence, arranged objects in ways that suggested relationships between different cases, and appeared to be trying to provide clues that might help solve their murders and bring their killers to justice. Stevens began documenting the supernatural communications using detailed notes about evidence movements, photographic patterns, and object arrangements that seemed to contain investigative information. His records revealed connections between supposedly unrelated cases, suggested new suspects in unsolved murders, and provided insights about crime scenes that had not been apparent to the original investigators. However, his attempts to share this supernatural intelligence with detectives and supervisors were met with skepticism and concerns about his mental health that threatened his career and credibility within the department. Dr. Elizabeth Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist consulted by the police department, evaluated Stevens's mental health status and found evidence of severe stress and trauma symptoms, but no indication of psychotic disorders or delusional thinking that might explain hallucinations. Dr. Rodriguez's assessment confirmed that Stevens was experiencing genuine psychological distress from real or perceived supernatural encounters, but could not determine whether the phenomena he reported were objectively real or the product of environmental stressors and isolation that had created susceptibility to paranormal experiences. The investigation into Stevens's reports revealed that similar supernatural activity had been reported sporadically by previous overnight staff at the evidence facility, but these reports had been dismissed as stress-related hallucinations or attempts to seek attention and reassignment to more desirable duties. The historical pattern of paranormal reports suggested that the evidence facility had been experiencing supernatural phenomena for years, but the department's institutional culture had discouraged acknowledgement or investigation of such incidents. Technical analysis of the evidence facility's environmental conditions revealed electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations that could not be explained through conventional building systems or equipment malfunction. The anomalies were most pronounced in areas where the oldest evidence was stored, particularly items from Unsolved, murder cases where the victims had died under violent circumstances and their killers had never been brought to justice. The most significant supernatural incident occurred when Stevens witnessed a complete reenactment of a triple murder from 1992, with invisible figures moving through the evidence storage area, while blood appeared on walls and floors in patterns that matched the original crime scene. The supernatural replay provided details about the murders that had not been documented in the case files, including the presence of a fourth victim who had apparently survived the initial attack but had been killed to prevent identification of the perpetrator. Stevens's documentation of the supernatural murder reenactment led to the reopening of the 1992 case and the identification of new evidence that had been overlooked during the original investigation. The supernatural intelligence proved accurate when verified against available records, and led to the arrest of a suspect who had evaded detection for over 30 years. However, the success of the supernatural investigation came at enormous psychological cost to Stevens, who had been forced to witness detailed recreations of brutal murders while being unable to intervene or help the victims. The department's response to the successful use of supernatural intelligence in solving a cold case created complex ethical and practical dilemmas about whether to continue utilizing Stevens's abilities despite the obvious mental health risks. The potential for solving numerous unsolved cases through supernatural communication with victims was compelling from a justice perspective, but the psychological damage to Stevens raised questions about whether such methods were ethically acceptable, even if they produced positive investigative results. Stevens's supervisor, Lieutenant Patricia Chang, made the decision to limit his exposure to the supernatural phenomena by assigning him to work with a partner during overnight shifts and restricting his access to evidence from the most violent unsolved cases. However, the presence of other staff members seemed to inhibit the supernatural activity, and the paranormal communication ceased when Stevens was not alone in the evidence facility, suggesting that the isolation and vulnerability of solo overnight work were necessary conditions for the supernatural contact. The final incident that led to Stevens' departure from the evidence facility occurred when he witnessed supernatural reenactments of crimes that had not yet been committed, with invisible figures demonstrating murders and assaults that would occur in the future unless prevented through police intervention. The precognitive supernatural communications placed Stevens in the position of having advanced knowledge of planned crimes, but without sufficient detail to identify specific victims or locations that would allow effective prevention efforts. Stevens's attempts to use the precognitive supernatural intelligence to prevent future crimes were largely unsuccessful due to the incomplete nature of the information and the difficulty of convincing investigators to act on supernatural guidance that could not be verified through conventional means. The frustration of possessing knowledge about planned violence while being unable to prevent it created additional psychological trauma that pushed Stevens beyond his capacity to cope with the supernatural demands of his position. Stevens submitted his resignation from the police department after 8 months of supernatural contact with crime victims, citing the impossibility of continuing to work in an environment where he was constantly exposed to violence and trauma that exceeded normal human capacity to process and understand. His departure represented the loss of a potentially valuable resource for solving cold cases, but his mental health and personal safety required removing him from circumstances that had transformed evidence storage into a form of psychological torture. The evidence facility was temporarily closed for extensive renovation and reorganization that included the installation of additional lighting, improved ventilation systems, and new security measures designed to reduce the isolation and environmental stressors that had contributed to Stevens's supernatural experiences. When the facility reopened, it was staffed with multiple officers during all shifts, and access to evidence from unsolved violent crimes was restricted to daylight hours when supervisory oversight was available. Today, Stevens works as a private investigator, specializing in cold cases, having developed techniques for analyzing physical evidence and identifying investigative leads that don't require supernatural communication with victims. His experience with paranormal phenomena has given him unique insights into the psychological aspects of violent crime and the importance of providing closure for victims' families, but he carefully avoids situations that might expose him to the kind of supernatural contact that had caused his psychological breakdown. The Riverside Police Department has quietly implemented policies acknowledging that some evidence storage facilities may experience unexplained phenomena that can affect staff mental health and operational effectiveness. These policies provide framework for supporting employees who report supernatural experiences while maintaining focus on conventional investigative methods that don't require officers to sacrifice their psychological well-being in pursuit of justice for crime victims. Stevens's legacy within the department includes the successful resolution of several cold cases that were solved using supernatural intelligence, but his experience has also served as a cautionary example of the personal costs associated with paranormal law enforcement methods. His case demonstrates that some forms of supernatural assistance may be too psychologically demanding for human officers to utilize safely, regardless of their potential value for solving crimes and achieving justice. For Stevens, the transition away from supernatural law enforcement has allowed him to continue serving crime victims and their families while protecting his mental health from the trauma associated with direct communication with the dead. His experience has shown that the boundary between helpful and harmful supernatural phenomena may depend on the psychological capacity of individual officers and the institutional support available for managing extraordinary circumstances that challenge normal understanding of police work. Officer Lisa Chang had been walking the overnight patrol beat in downtown Portland's Old Town district for 18 months when the shadows began following her with malicious intent. Dark shapes that moved independently of any light source, reaching toward her with what appeared to be grasping fingers or claws, whispering threats and accusations that grew progressively more personal and disturbing as the nights wore on, transforming her familiar patrol route into a gauntlet of supernatural harassment that made every dark alley and empty doorway a potential source of psychological attack during the vulnerable hours when she was alone on foot in an urban environment that had become actively hostile to her presence. The Old Town district encompassed 12 city blocks of historic buildings, narrow alleys, and recessed doorways that created numerous shadows and blind spots even during daylight hours. But at night, the area became a labyrinth of darkness, broken only by scattered streetlights and the occasional neon sign from late-night businesses that remained open to serve the district's population of homeless individuals, substance users, and others who existed on the margins of urban society. Chang's assignment to Foot Patrol reflected the department's community policing strategy, which emphasized personal contact and relationship building with residents who were often suspicious of police vehicles, and more likely to cooperate with officers they could meet face-to-face. Chang had volunteered for the challenging assignment because her fluency in multiple languages and her background in social work made her effective at de-escalating conflicts and connecting vulnerable individuals with social services and support resources that could address underlying problems rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system. Her approach to policing emphasized building trust and providing assistance rather than enforcement and arrest, creating relationships with community members who viewed her as a resource rather than a threat. The supernatural harassment began subtly during Chang's routine patrol on September 4th, 2023, when she noticed that her shadow appeared to be moving independently of her body, reaching toward doorways and alley entrances as if searching for something or someone hidden in the darkness. Initially, she attributed the anomaly to the complex interplay of multiple light sources creating optical illusions, but as the night progressed, the shadow's movements became increasingly erratic and seemed to respond to her thoughts and emotions rather than following the normal laws of physics that governed how shadows should behave. The independent movement of her shadow was accompanied by whispered voices that seemed to emanate from dark areas where homeless individuals often sheltered, but the voices were speaking her name and making references to personal information that strangers shouldn't have known. Details about her family background, her reasons for becoming a police officer, and private thoughts that she had never shared with anyone. The whispers carried an undertone of menace that suggested supernatural entities were attempting to intimidate and psychologically destabilize her during the isolated conditions of overnight foot patrol. Chang's attempts to investigate the sources of the whispers led her into alleys and doorways where she found no human presence that could explain the voices, but where the supernatural harassment intensified with shadows that seemed to reach toward her from impossible directions and whispered threats that became more specific and personal. The entities appeared to possess knowledge about her past experiences, her fears and vulnerabilities, and her personal relationships in ways that suggested long-term observation and malicious intent. The psychological impact of being constantly watched and threatened by supernatural entities while attempting to perform her police duties created severe stress that affected Chang's ability to interact effectively with community members and respond appropriately to the various social problems she encountered during her patrol. The knowledge that hostile supernatural forces were monitoring her every movement and looking for opportunities to attack made it difficult to maintain the calm, professional demeanor that was essential for successful community policing. More disturbing was Chang's realization that the supernatural entities seemed to be attempting to manipulate her behavior and decision-making processes by creating distractions and psychological pressure during critical moments when she needed to respond to emergencies or make important judgments about how to handle dangerous situations. The whispered threats and shadow movements would intensify whenever she encountered domestic violence incidents, mental health crises, or other volatile situations where her intervention could mean the difference between safety and tragedy. The supernatural harassment appeared to be designed to compromise Chang's effectiveness as a police officer by creating constant fear and distraction that would prevent her from providing appropriate assistance to community members who depended on her protection and support. The entities seemed to understand that undermining her confidence and decision-making abilities would have cascading effects on public safety and community trust that extended far beyond their direct attacks on her personal well-being. Chang's supervisor, Sergeant Michael Davis, initially attributed her reports of supernatural harassment to the stress associated with foot patrol work in a challenging urban environment. But his own observation of Chang's patrol activities revealed unexplained phenomena that corroborated her accounts of supernatural attacks. Davis witnessed shadows moving in ways that defied normal lighting conditions, and heard whispered voices that seemed to be targeting Chang specifically with threats and intimidation. The investigation into Chang's supernatural harassment revealed that similar experiences had been reported by other officers who had worked foot patrol in the Old Town District, particularly those who had demonstrated effectiveness at community policing and had built strong relationships with vulnerable populations. The pattern suggested that the supernatural entities were specifically targeting officers who were succeeding at their protective duties, attempting to drive away effective community police officers and leave vulnerable populations without adequate protection. Dr. Amanda Foster, a parapsychologist consulted by the police department, theorized that the Old Town District's history of violence and urban decay might have created conditions that attracted or manifested supernatural entities that fed on fear and desperation. Dr. Foster suggested that Chang's positive impact on the community might have threatened entities that preferred environments of neglect and suffering, leading to organized supernatural resistance to her police work. The supernatural attacks escalated when Chang began receiving threatening messages written in what appeared to be human blood on walls and surfaces throughout her patrol route. Messages that contained specific threats against her family members and detailed descriptions of violent acts that the entities claimed they would perpetrate if she continued her police work in the district. The messages demonstrated knowledge about her personal life that suggested the supernatural surveillance extended beyond her working hours and into her private residence and personal relationships. Chang's attempts to document the supernatural harassment using photographs and video recordings produced evidence that captured the threatening messages and some of the unusual shadow movements, but failed to record the whispered voices or provide clear documentation of the entities themselves. The partial evidence confirmed that abnormal phenomena were occurring, but didn't provide sufficient proof to convince skeptical colleagues or justify official departmental response to supernatural threats. The most terrifying escalation occurred when the supernatural entities began manifesting. Physical effects that posed direct threats to Chang's safety during her patrol duties, including creating obstacles that could cause her to trip or fall, manipulating environmental hazards like broken glass or unstable structures, and interfering with her radio communications during emergency situations when she needed to call for backup or coordinate with other officers. The physical manifestations of supernatural hostility transformed Chang's patrol route into an active danger zone where she faced threats that went beyond the normal risks associated with urban police work, creating situations where supernatural entities were actively attempting to injure or kill her while she was trying to protect and serve community members who depended on her professional assistance. Chang's request for reassignment to different duties was initially denied due to her effectiveness at community policing and the positive relationships she had built with Old Town residents, who specifically requested her assistance with various problems. However, the escalating supernatural attacks eventually forced the department to acknowledge that continuing her assignment to foot patrol in the district posed unacceptable risks to her safety and well-being. The supernatural harassment reached its climax when entities began appearing as visible manifestations during Chang's patrol, taking the form of humanoid shadows that moved through the district while making threatening gestures and attempting to physically interfere with her police work. The visible entities were observed by community members and other officers, providing independent corroboration of the supernatural attacks and forcing the department to acknowledge that Chang was facing genuine threats that required immediate intervention. Dr. Robert Kim, a police psychologist, evaluated Chang's mental health status and found evidence of severe stress and trauma symptoms resulting from prolonged exposure to supernatural harassment, but no indication of psychological disorders that might explain hallucinatory experiences. Dr. Kim's assessment confirmed that Chang was experiencing real supernatural attacks that had created legitimate psychological trauma, requiring professional treatment and removal from the threatening environment. The police department's response included installing additional lighting throughout Chang's patrol route, assigning her a partner for all foot patrol duties, and consulting with religious leaders and paranormal specialists who might be able to provide guidance for addressing supernatural threats against police officers. However, these measures proved ineffective against entities that seemed to be specifically targeting Chang, regardless of environmental modifications or additional security precautions. Chang's final night of foot patrol in the Old Town district resulted in a supernatural attack that left her physically injured when entities manifested sufficient physical presence to push her down a flight of concrete steps, causing injuries that required hospitalization and medical treatment. The physical assault represented an escalation beyond psychological harassment into direct violence that posed immediate danger to her life and safety. Chang submitted her resignation from the police department immediately after her release from the hospital, citing the impossibility of continuing law enforcement work in an environment where supernatural entities were actively attempting to kill her for performing her professional duties. Her departure represented the loss of an exceptionally effective community police officer, but her safety required removing her from circumstances that had transformed protective service into personal endangerment. The Old Town Foot Patrol assignment was eliminated following Chang's resignation, with the district being covered by vehicle patrols that maintained greater distance from the supernatural entities and reduced officer vulnerability to direct attack. However, the change in patrol methods also reduced the department's effectiveness at community policing and relationship building, resulting in increased social problems and decreased cooperation between police and community members. Today, Chang works as a victim advocate for a nonprofit organization that provides services to survivors of domestic violence and other crimes, having found a way to continue helping vulnerable populations while avoiding the supernatural threats that had made police work impossible. Her experience has provided her with unique insights into the psychological impact of supernatural harassment and the importance of believing and supporting individuals who report paranormal attacks. The Portland Police Bureau has quietly developed protocols for managing officers who report supernatural harassment or threats, providing mental health support and alternative assignments that protect officer safety while acknowledging the reality of paranormal phenomena that can affect law enforcement work. These protocols recognize that some forms of police work may expose officers to supernatural threats that require understanding and accommodation, rather than dismissal or skepticism. Chang's legacy within the department includes the successful community relationships she built during her time in Old Town, and the policy changes that provide better support for officers who encounter supernatural phenomena during their duties. Her case has demonstrated that supernatural threats against police officers can be real and dangerous, requiring institutional responses that protect officer safety while maintaining focus on public service and community protection. For Chang, the transition away from law enforcement has allowed her to continue serving vulnerable populations while protecting herself from supernatural attacks that had transformed her protective duties into personal endangerment. Her experience has shown that some environments may be too dangerous for police work when supernatural entities actively oppose law enforcement presence and are willing to use violence to drive officers away from communities that need protection. The ongoing mystery of why supernatural entities targeted Chang, specifically for harassment and violence, remains unsolved, but her experience has contributed to growing awareness within law enforcement that Some threats to officer safety may come from sources that exceed conventional understanding, while requiring the same professional response and institutional support that protects officers from more conventional dangers. Officer Brian Murphy had been monitoring the overnight radio frequencies for the Essex County Sheriff's Department for 4 years when the emergency calls began coming from people who had been dead for decades. Clear, desperate voices pleading for help with crimes that had occurred in the 1970s and 1980s, transmitted on frequencies that should have been silent, speaking with the same urgency and terror that had characterized their final moments before being murdered by killers who had never been caught, creating a supernatural, dispatching nightmare that forced Murphy to listen helplessly to the death agonies of countless victims while being unable to provide the assistance they desperately needed during those horrible final moments of their lives. The Essex County Sheriff's Department operated a centralized dispatch center that coordinated emergency responses across 300 square miles of rural Massachusetts territory, monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously while maintaining communication with patrol units, fire departments, emergency medical services, and state police agencies that provided mutual aid during major incidents. Murphy's assignment to the overnight dispatch desk reflected his technical expertise with radio communications and his ability to remain calm during high-stress situations that required quick decision-making and precise coordination of emergency resources. The dispatch center was housed in the basement of the county courthouse, a building that had been constructed in 1923 and had served as the hub of law enforcement activity for the region throughout its history, including periods when communication technology was primitive and emergency response capabilities were limited compared to modern standards. The radio equipment occupied a room that had been retrofitted multiple times to accommodate advancing technology, but which retained much of its original architecture and institutional atmosphere that reflected decades of emergency communications and crisis management. Murphy's duties involved monitoring 6 different radio frequencies simultaneously while maintaining logs of all communications, dispatching appropriate emergency units to reported incidents, and coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions when situations required resources beyond Essex County's capabilities. The overnight shift was typically quieter than day or evening hours, but still required constant attention and readiness to respond to emergencies that could develop rapidly and require immediate action to prevent loss of life or property. The supernatural emergency calls began during Murphy's shift on November 8, 2023, when an older analog frequency that had been abandoned for over a decade suddenly activated with a woman's voice frantically reporting a home invasion in progress at an address that Murphy recognized from cold case files as the location of an unsolved murder from 1979. The caller identified herself as Margaret Holloway, providing details about armed intruders who had broken into her farmhouse and were threatening to kill her and her 2 young children unless she revealed the location of money they believed was hidden in the house. Murphy's immediate response was to dispatch patrol units to the address, but the farmhouse had been demolished in 1995 following a fire, and the property was now vacant land that showed no signs of current habitation or criminal activity. The responding officers found nothing unusual at the location, but Murphy's radio continued receiving Margaret Holloway's increasingly desperate calls for help as she described the torture and sexual assault that preceded her murder and the brutal killing of her children who had witnessed the invasion. The calls from Margaret Holloway lasted for 47 minutes, documenting in horrific detail the home invasion murder that had remained unsolved for over 40 years. Murphy was forced to listen to the entire supernatural replay of the murders while being unable to provide any assistance or intervention that might have saved the victims from their terrible fate. Investigation of the radio frequency revealed that the abandoned analog channel should have been completely inactive, with no technical explanation for how it could carry voice communications or how those communications could originate from a location where no radio equipment existed. The frequency had been decommissioned when the county upgraded to digital radio systems, and all transmitting equipment had been removed or repurposed for other uses. The second supernatural emergency call occurred 3 nights later, when Murphy received a transmission from Robert Chen, a college student who had been murdered in 1983 while working as a night security guard at a warehouse that had subsequently been converted into apartment buildings. Chen's voice described in real time the approach of armed robbers who had expected the warehouse to be empty, but had encountered him during their break-in attempt, and had decided to eliminate the witness to their crime. Chen's supernatural emergency call provided details about the robbery and murder that had never been discovered during the original investigation, including information about additional perpetrators who had not been identified as suspects and evidence that had been overlooked at the crime scene. Murphy was forced to listen as Chen described his own torture and murder while pleading for police assistance that could never arrive in time to save him from killers who had escaped justice for 40 years. The pattern established by the first 2 supernatural calls continued with increasing frequency as Murphy's radio began receiving emergency transmissions from victims of unsolved murders throughout Essex County's history, each call providing real-time documentation of violent crimes that had occurred decades earlier, while forcing Murphy to experience the helplessness and frustration of being unable to provide assistance to people who were crying out for help during their final moments of life. The psychological impact of listening to detailed descriptions of torture, sexual assault, and murder on a nightly basis created severe mental health challenges for Murphy, who found himself unable to disconnect emotionally from the supernatural emergency calls despite knowing that the victims had been dead for decades and that no intervention was possible. The constant exposure to violence and human suffering began affecting his ability to sleep, maintain personal relationships, and function effectively during his off-duty hours. More disturbing was Murphy's realization that the supernatural emergency calls were not random replays of past events, but seemed to be attempts by murder victims to communicate information that could lead to the identification and prosecution of their killers. The calls included details about perpetrators' physical appearances, vehicle descriptions, and criminal methods that had not been documented in the original case files, suggesting that the victims retained memories and knowledge that could be valuable for solving their murders. Murphy began documenting the supernatural emergency calls in detailed logs that recorded the victims' identities, the circumstances of their deaths, and the investigative information they provided during their desperate pleas for help. His records revealed patterns connecting multiple unsolved murders, identified potential suspects who had not been considered during the original investigations, and provided new leads that could be pursued by cold case detectives if they were willing to act on supernatural intelligence. However, Murphy's attempts to share the supernatural emergency information with investigators and supervisors were met with skepticism and concern about his mental health that threatened his career and credibility within the department. The detailed nature of the information and its apparent accuracy when verified against case files created confusion about how Murphy could have gained access to investigative details that were not generally available to dispatch personnel. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist consulted by the Sheriff's Department, evaluated Murphy's mental health status and found evidence of severe stress and trauma symptoms resulting from repeated exposure to supernatural descriptions of violence, but no indication of psychological disorders that might explain hallucinatory experiences. Dr. Williams confirmed that Murphy was experiencing genuine psychological distress from real or perceived supernatural communications, but could not determine the objective reality of the phenomena he reported. The investigation into Murphy's supernatural emergency calls revealed that similar experiences had been reported by previous overnight dispatchers, but these reports had been dismissed as stress-related hallucinations or attempts to seek attention and reassignment to different duties. The historical pattern of paranormal reports suggested that the dispatch center had been experiencing supernatural phenomena for years, but the department's institutional culture had discouraged acknowledgement or investigation of such incidents. Technical analysis of the radio equipment revealed electromagnetic anomalies and frequency variations that could not be explained through conventional communication theory or equipment malfunction. The anomalies were most pronounced during the overnight hours when Murphy worked alone in the dispatch center, suggesting that isolation and environmental factors might contribute to the manifestation of supernatural communications. The most disturbing supernatural call occurred when Murphy received an emergency transmission from a victim whose murder was in progress at that very moment, with the caller providing real-time updates about a violent crime that was occurring simultaneously in a location where patrol units were able to respond and potentially prevent the murder. However, when officers arrived at the address, they found only an empty house with no signs of criminal activity or human presence. Investigation of the contemporary emergency call revealed that the address belonged to a family that had been murdered at that location in 1981. But the house had been vacant for over a decade with no current residents who could have made the call. The supernatural transmission had apparently been a replay of the historical murder rather than a report of current criminal activity. But the timing and realism of the call had created false hope that intervention might be possible. Murphy's psychological breakdown occurred when he received simultaneous emergency calls from multiple murder victims, whose deaths spanned 4 decades of violent crime in Essex County, creating a cacophony of desperate voices pleading for help while describing torture, rape, and murder in graphic detail that overwhelmed his ability to process and respond to the supernatural communications. The overlapping calls lasted for over 2 hours, forcing Murphy to listen to dozens of murders while being completely unable to provide assistance or relief to any of the victims. The mass supernatural emergency call event triggered Murphy's request for immediate reassignment to different duties, citing the impossibility of continuing dispatch work in an environment where he was subjected to constant psychological torture through forced exposure to detailed descriptions of violent crime. His departure from the dispatch center represented the loss of an experienced communications specialist, but his mental health required removing him from circumstances that had transformed emergency response coordination into a form of supernatural psychological abuse. The dispatch center was temporarily closed for extensive renovation and reorganization that included the installation of new radio equipment, improved soundproofing, and additional staffing during overnight hours to reduce the isolation that had contributed to Murphy's supernatural experiences. When the center reopened, it was staffed with multiple dispatchers during all shifts, and access to historical case files was restricted to prevent dispatchers from gaining knowledge that might influence their perception of supernatural communications. However, the supernatural emergency calls continued despite the environmental modifications and staffing changes, suggesting that the phenomena were not dependent on individual susceptibility or environmental conditions, but represented a genuine supernatural characteristic of the dispatch center that would affect any personnel assigned to monitor radio communications during overnight hours. Sheriff Robert Martinez made the decision to relocate dispatch operations to a modern facility that had no historical connection to violent crime or traumatic events, hoping that a change of location might eliminate the supernatural communications that it created psychological hazards for dispatch personnel. The old dispatch center was converted to storage use and sealed to prevent future exposure of staff to supernatural phenomena that had proven impossible to control or eliminate. Today, Murphy works as a 911 operator for a private ambulance service in a different state, having relocated to escape the memories and trauma associated with his supernatural dispatch experiences in Essex County. His new position involves coordinating emergency medical responses without the psychological burden of supernatural communications from murder victims, allowing him to continue serving public safety while protecting his mental health from further exposure to paranormal phenomena. The Essex County Sheriff's Department has implemented policies acknowledging that some communication facilities may experience supernatural phenomena that can affect staff mental health and operational effectiveness, providing framework for supporting employees who report paranormal experiences while maintaining focus on conventional emergency response methods that don't require personnel to sacrifice their psychological well-being in service of supernatural communications. Murphy's legacy within the department includes the documentation of numerous unsolved murders that were described in detail during supernatural emergency calls, providing investigative leads that have contributed to the resolution of several cold cases. However, his experience has also served as a cautionary example of the personal costs associated with supernatural law enforcement communications, and the importance of protecting personnel from psychological hazards that exceed normal occupational stressors. The ongoing mystery of why murder victims are able to communicate through abandoned radio frequencies remains unsolved, but Murphy's experience has contributed to growing awareness within law enforcement that some communication systems may be susceptible to supernatural interference that requires acknowledgement and management rather than denial or dismissal. His case demonstrates that the boundary between normal emergency communications and supernatural phenomena may be more permeable than conventional understanding suggests, particularly in facilities with long histories of emergency response and crisis management. For Murphy, the transition away from supernatural emergency communications has allowed him to continue serving public safety while protecting his mental health from the trauma associated with forced exposure to detailed descriptions of violent crime. His experience has shown that some forms of supernatural contact may be too psychologically demanding for human operators to manage safely, regardless of their potential value for solving crimes and achieving justice for murder victims. The supernatural emergency calls that tormented Murphy during his time as an overnight dispatcher continued to occur in the sealed dispatch center, with security personnel reporting occasional radio transmissions from the abandoned facility during late-night hours. Whether these continuing communications represent ongoing attempts by murder victims to seek help or simply electromagnetic echoes of past supernatural contact remains unclear. But the phenomenon serves as a permanent reminder of the psychological costs associated with supernatural law enforcement communications. Officer Daniel Rodriguez had been conducting overnight prisoner interviews at the Clearwater County Detention Center for 7 years when the suspects began confessing to crimes they hadn't committed. Not false confessions driven by psychological pressure or investigative manipulation, but detailed admissions to murders, rapes, and disappearances that had occurred decades before the suspects were born, spoken in voices that didn't belong to them and containing information that only the actual perpetrators could have known, transforming Rodriguez's interrogation room into a supernatural courtroom where the dead seemed to be using living prisoners as vessels to finally confess their sins and reveal the locations of evidence that had been hidden for generations. What began as routine questioning of a shoplifting suspect on December 3, 2023, evolved into a nightmare scenario where Rodriguez found himself helplessly witnessing possessed criminals describing horrific acts of violence in graphic detail, while being completely unable to stop the supernatural confessions that poured from their mouths during the vulnerable hours when the detention center was nearly empty, and the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to dissolve entirely within the sterile walls of the interview facility. The Clearwater County Detention Center housed approximately 800 inmates in a modern facility that had been constructed in 1998 to replace an aging jail that had been demolished due to overcrowding and safety concerns. But the new building had been erected on the same site where the original County Jail had operated since 1923, creating a continuous history of incarceration and human suffering that spanned nearly a century of criminal justice operations. The overnight shift to the detention center required skeleton staffing that left individual officers responsible for monitoring large sections of the facility, while conducting necessary interviews with prisoners who had been arrested during evening hours and needed to be processed before morning court appearances. Rodriguez's assignment to the overnight interview schedule reflected his expertise in criminal psychology and his ability to extract information from reluctant suspects through patient questioning and psychological insight that helped him understand the motivations and methods of various criminal personalities. His success rate at obtaining confessions and gathering intelligence about criminal enterprises made him a valuable asset to the detective division, which relied on his overnight interrogations to build cases against suspects who might become less cooperative after consulting with attorneys or having time to develop coordinated defense strategies. The interview room where Rodriguez conducted his questioning was located in the basement level of the detention center, a sterile environment equipped with recording equipment and designed to create psychological pressure on suspects while ensuring their constitutional rights were protected during the interrogation process. The room's institutional lighting, bare concrete walls, and minimal furnishings created an atmosphere of isolation and vulnerability that experienced interrogators understood could be psychologically advantageous for encouraging truthful responses from individuals who might otherwise attempt to mislead investigators about their criminal activities. The supernatural confessions began during Rodriguez's routine questioning of Marcus Thompson, a 23-year-old man who had been arrested for shoplifting electronic equipment from a department store, but who suddenly began describing in horrific detail the rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl named Sarah Chen, a crime that had occurred in 1987 when Thompson had been an infant and could not possibly have been involved in the violent death that had remained unsolved for over 30 years. Thompson's voice changed as he spoke, taking on the speech patterns and regional accent of someone from a different geographical area, while his facial expressions and body language transformed in ways that suggested he was no longer entirely himself during the supernatural confession. The details Thompson provided about Sarah Chen's murder included information that had never been released to the public and matched evidence from the original crime scene that only the actual perpetrator could have known, including the specific type of rope used to bind the victim, the location where her body had been disposed of, and the personal items that had been taken as trophies by the killer. Thompson spoke as if he were reliving the murder from the perpetrator's perspective, describing the planning, execution, and aftermath of the crime with emotional detachment that suggested he was serving as a conduit for someone else's memories and experiences. Rodriguez's attempts to interrupt Thompson's confession and redirect the questioning to the shoplifting charges met with resistance as Thompson continued his detailed description of the child murder, apparently compelled to complete the supernatural confession regardless of Rodriguez's efforts to control the interrogation. The recording equipment captured every word of Thompson's impossible testimony, creating an audio record of a confession that could potentially solve a decades-old murder case, but which had been obtained through supernatural means that challenged the legal and ethical frameworks that governed criminal interrogations. The psychological impact of listening to detailed descriptions of child murder spoken through the mouth of a young man who had clearly been possessed by the spirit of a deceased killer created immediate trauma for Rodriguez, who found himself trapped in the interview room with the suspect who was no longer entirely human and who was describing acts of violence that exceeded normal human capacity to process and understand. The supernatural confession lasted for 2 hours and 17 minutes, during which Thompson provided information about multiple child murders that had occurred throughout the 1980s and 1990s, all committed by the same killer who had apparently died without ever being caught or identified. When the supernatural confession finally ended, Thompson collapsed in exhaustion and claimed to have no memory of what he had said during the interrogation, genuinely confused about why he was being questioned about child murders when he had only been arrested for shoplifting. His bewilderment appeared authentic, suggesting that he had been completely unaware of the supernatural possession that had used his body to confess to crimes he had never committed, leaving Rodriguez with the disturbing realization that he had witnessed something that exceeded normal understanding of human consciousness and criminal behavior. The investigation into Thompson's supernatural confession revealed that the details he had provided were accurate when compared to original case files from the unsolved child murders, confirming that the information could only have come from someone with direct knowledge of the crimes or access to evidence that had been carefully protected throughout the investigations. The precision and completeness of the supernatural testimony suggested that the actual perpetrator's consciousness had somehow survived death and was attempting to confess through living individuals who had been brought into the detention center's interview room. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a forensic psychologist consulted by the Sheriff's Department, evaluated Thompson's mental health status and found no evidence of psychological disorders that might explain his detailed knowledge of crimes that had occurred before his birth. Thompson's psychological profile indicated normal cognitive function and no history of violent behavior or criminal activity beyond minor property crimes, making it impossible to explain his supernatural confession through conventional psychological or criminological theories. The second supernatural confession occurred 1 week later, when Rodriguez was interviewing Patricia Williams, a 38-year-old woman who had been arrested for driving under the influence, but who suddenly began describing her participation in a series of armed robberies that had occurred in the 1970s, speaking in a gravelly male voice that clearly didn't belong to her, while providing detailed information about bank robberies, armored car heists, and the murder of security guards who had attempted to resist the criminal enterprise. Williams' physical appearance seemed to change as she spoke, her facial features becoming more angular and masculine, while her body language adopted aggressive postures that were completely unlike her normal demeanor. The supernatural confession revealed the identities of gang members who had committed dozens of violent crimes throughout the 1970s and 1980s, including the locations of buried money and weapons that had never been recovered by law enforcement despite extensive investigations. Williams, speaking in the voice of the deceased gang leader, described the organizational structure of the criminal enterprise, the methods used to plan and execute robberies, and the internal conflicts that had eventually led to violent confrontations between gang members who had been eliminated to prevent them from cooperating with law enforcement. Rodriguez found himself listening helplessly as Williams described torture sessions, execution-style murders, and the disposal of bodies in remote locations that had never been discovered, despite extensive searches by multiple law enforcement agencies. The supernatural confession included detailed maps of burial sites, descriptions of evidence that had been hidden in safe deposit boxes and storage facilities, and the identities of corrupt officials who had been bribed to provide protection for the criminal enterprise. The recording of Williams' supernatural confession provided law enforcement with intelligence that could potentially solve dozens of cold cases and recover millions of dollars in stolen money and evidence, but the information had been obtained through supernatural means that raised serious questions about its admissibility in court proceedings and its reliability as the basis for criminal investigations. The legal system had no framework for dealing with confessions obtained through supernatural possession, creating complex procedural challenges that no prosecutor or judge had ever encountered. The pattern of supernatural confessions continued with increasing frequency, as Rodriguez found himself conducting interviews with suspects who were being possessed by the spirits of deceased criminals, each session revealing new information about unsolved crimes while forcing him to witness detailed descriptions of violence and brutality that exceeded normal human capacity to process and understand. The interview room became a supernatural tribunal, where the dead seemed to be using living prisoners to finally confess their sins and reveal the truth about crimes that had remained hidden for decades. The psychological toll of conducting supernatural interrogations on a nightly basis created severe mental health challenges for Rodriguez, who found himself unable to sleep during off-duty hours due to intrusive memories of the horrific crimes he had been forced to witness through the confessions of possessed suspects. The constant exposure to detailed descriptions of murder, rape, torture, and other forms of violence began affecting his ability to maintain normal social relationships and function effectively in his personal life outside of work. More disturbing was Rodriguez's growing realization that the supernatural confessions were not random events, but seemed to be coordinated by an intelligence that understood the criminal justice system, and was attempting to use the interview process to reveal information that could bring closure to victims' families and justice to cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The possessed suspects seemed to be chosen specifically for their vulnerability to supernatural influence, with individuals who had histories of substance abuse, mental illness, or psychological trauma being more susceptible to possession by deceased criminals who wanted to confess their crimes. The supernatural confessions revealed connections between seemingly unrelated cases, identified serial killers who had operated across multiple jurisdictions, and provided evidence that could resolve hundreds of cold cases if law enforcement agencies were willing to act on information obtained through supernatural means. The intelligence gathered through the possessed suspects was consistently accurate when verified against existing evidence, suggesting that the supernatural confessions represented genuine communications from deceased criminals rather than psychological delusions or false memories. Rodriguez's supervisor, Captain Michael Chen, initially attributed the supernatural confessions to Rodriguez's exceptional interrogation skills and his ability to extract information from suspects through psychological manipulation. But his observation of the interview process revealed phenomena that clearly exceeded normal human capabilities. Chen witnessed suspects speaking in voices that didn't belong to them, providing information they couldn't possibly have known, and exhibiting behavior patterns that suggested they were no longer entirely themselves during the supernatural possessions. The investigation into the supernatural confessions revealed that similar incidents had been reported sporadically by other interrogators throughout the detention center's history. But these reports had been dismissed as stress-related hallucinations or attempts to seek attention and reassignment to different duties. The historical pattern of supernatural reports suggested that the interview facility had been experiencing paranormal phenomena for years, but the institutional culture had discouraged acknowledgement or investigation of such incidents. Technical analysis of the interview room revealed electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations that could not be explained through conventional environmental factors or equipment malfunction. The anomalies were most pronounced during the overnight hours when Rodriguez conducted his interviews, suggesting that the isolation and reduced staffing of the graveyard shift created conditions that were conducive to supernatural manifestations and paranormal activity. The most disturbing supernatural confession occurred when Rodriguez was interviewing James Morrison, a middle-aged man who had been arrested for public intoxication, but who suddenly began describing his role in a satanic cult that had operated in the county during the 1980s, speaking in multiple voices that belonged to different deceased cult members while providing detailed information about ritual murders, child sacrifice, and the systematic abuse of victims who had been chosen for their vulnerability and isolation from protective social networks. Morrison's supernatural confession revealed the existence of a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for over a decade, protected by influential community members who had participated in the cult's activities and had used their positions of authority to prevent investigation and prosecution of the crimes. The possessed suspect described underground facilities where rituals had been conducted, the identities of prominent citizens who had been involved in the cult's activities, and the locations of burial sites where victims had been disposed of after being tortured and murdered. The supernatural revelation of organized satanic crime created a crisis for the sheriff's department, which faced the possibility that respected community members might be exposed as participants in ritual murder and child abuse based on information obtained through supernatural possession of a drunk suspect who had no conscious knowledge of the crimes he was describing. The implications of the supernatural confession extended beyond individual criminal cases to suggest systematic corruption and conspiracy that had protected violent criminals for decades. Rodriguez's mental health deteriorated rapidly as he was forced to listen to increasingly graphic descriptions of ritual torture, child murder, and satanic abuse that exceeded normal human capacity to process and understand. The supernatural confessions included details about the systematic abuse of children, the torture of victims who had been kept alive for extended periods, and the consumption of human remains during ritual ceremonies that represented the absolute extremes of human evil and depravity. The psychological impact of witnessing supernatural confessions to the most heinous crimes imaginable created post-traumatic stress symptoms that affected Rodriguez's ability to function in his personal life and maintain his professional effectiveness as an interrogator. The constant exposure to detailed descriptions of violence against children and other vulnerable victims triggered anxiety, depression, and intrusive memories that interfered with his sleep, appetite, and ability to maintain normal social relationships. Dr. Patricia Williams, a trauma specialist consulted by the Sheriff's Department, evaluated Rodriguez's mental health status and found evidence of severe psychological trauma resulting from prolonged exposure to supernatural descriptions of extreme violence. Dr. Williams confirmed that Rodriguez was experiencing genuine psychological distress from real supernatural phenomena, but noted that continued exposure to such material would likely result in permanent psychological damage that could affect his ability to function in any capacity. The supernatural confessions reached their climax when Rodriguez was simultaneously interviewed by multiple possessed suspects who had been brought to the detention center on the same night, creating a cacophony of supernatural voices describing different crimes while providing overlapping testimony about criminal enterprises that had operated throughout the county's history. The overlapping confessions lasted for over 4 hours and revealed the existence of multiple criminal organizations that had been connected through shared membership, mutual protection agreements, and coordinated activities that had allowed them to operate with impunity for decades. The mass supernatural confession event provided law enforcement with intelligence that could potentially revolutionize their understanding of organized crime in the county, but the information had been obtained through supernatural means that challenged every assumption about criminal investigation and legal procedure. The possessed suspects described criminal activities that spanned multiple decades and involved hundreds of perpetrators, victims, and witnesses, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic criminality that had been hidden from law enforcement through corruption, intimidation, and violence. Rodriguez's psychological breakdown occurred during the mass supernatural confession event, when the overwhelming flood of detailed descriptions of violence and depravity exceeded his capacity to process and understand the information being provided through the possessed suspects. The combination of multiple supernatural voices describing different crimes simultaneously created a sensory overload that triggered a complete psychological collapse, leaving Rodriguez unable to continue his duties as an interrogator. The Sheriff's Department's response to Rodriguez's breakdown included immediate psychological intervention and medical leave that removed him from the detention center environment, where he had been exposed to supernatural phenomena that had caused severe psychological trauma. The interview room where the supernatural confessions had occurred was sealed, pending investigation, and overnight interrogations were suspended indefinitely while administrators attempted to understand and address the paranormal activity that had affected their operations. The investigation into the supernatural confessions revealed that the detention center had been built on the site of the original county jail, which had a history of violence and death that might have created conditions conducive to supernatural manifestations and paranormal activity. The accumulated trauma and suffering associated with decades of incarceration and criminal justice operations had apparently created a spiritual environment where deceased criminals could communicate through living prisoners who were vulnerable to supernatural influence. The supernatural confessions provided law enforcement with detailed information about hundreds of unsolved crimes, but the legal system had no framework for using evidence obtained through supernatural means in criminal prosecutions. The information was accurate when verified against existing evidence, but prosecutors and judges were reluctant to base criminal cases on confessions obtained through supernatural possession of suspects who had no conscious knowledge of the crimes they were describing. The ethical implications of using supernatural confessions in criminal investigations created complex moral dilemmas for law enforcement administrators who recognized the potential value of the information while acknowledging the psychological costs to personnel who were exposed to supernatural phenomena. The supernatural intelligence could potentially solve numerous cold cases and bring closure to victims' families, but the human cost of obtaining such information through supernatural means raised questions about whether the benefits justified the risks to officer mental health and psychological well-being. Rodriguez's departure from the sheriff's department following his psychological breakdown represented the loss of an experienced interrogator whose supernatural experiences had provided valuable intelligence about criminal activities, but whose mental health had been permanently damaged by exposure to supernatural phenomena that exceeded normal human capacity to process and understand. His case became a cautionary example within law enforcement about the psychological dangers of supernatural criminal investigation and the importance of protecting personnel from paranormal exposures that could cause lasting psychological harm. The detention center's interview facilities were extensively renovated following Rodriguez's breakdown, with new lighting, ventilation systems, and security measures designed to reduce the environmental factors that might contribute to supernatural manifestations. The overnight interview schedule was eliminated, and all prisoner interrogations were restricted to daylight hours when supervisory oversight was available, and the psychological pressure on individual officers was reduced through increased staffing and support. However, the supernatural confessions continued to occur sporadically in the renovated interview facilities, suggesting that the paranormal activity was not dependent on environmental conditions, but represented a genuine characteristic of the detention center that would affect any personnel assigned to conduct prisoner interviews, regardless of the precautions taken to prevent supernatural manifestations. The ongoing supernatural activity forced administrators to acknowledge that some aspects of criminal investigation might involve phenomena that exceeded normal understanding while requiring special protocols to protect personnel from psychological harm. Today, Rodriguez works as a private investigator specializing in missing persons cases, having developed techniques for gathering information and analyzing evidence that don't require direct contact with suspects or exposure to supernatural phenomena. His experience with supernatural confessions has given him unique insights into criminal psychology and the importance of protecting investigators from psychological trauma that can result from exposure to extreme violence and depravity. The Clearwater County Sheriff's Department has quietly established protocols for managing supernatural phenomena in criminal investigations, providing mental health support for personnel who report paranormal experiences while maintaining focus on conventional investigative methods that don't require officers to sacrifice their psychological well-being in pursuit of criminal intelligence. These protocols acknowledge that some aspects of criminal investigation may involve supernatural elements while emphasizing the importance of protecting personnel from psychological harm that can result from exposure to paranormal activity. Rodriguez's legacy within law enforcement includes the intelligence gathered through supernatural confessions that has contributed to the resolution of numerous cold cases. But his experience has also served as a cautionary example of the personal costs associated with supernatural criminal investigation. His case has demonstrated that some forms of criminal intelligence may be too psychologically demanding for human investigators to obtain safely, regardless of their potential value for solving crimes and achieving justice. The supernatural confessions that Rodriguez witnessed during his time as an overnight interrogator have been documented and preserved as potential evidence in cold cases, but the information remains largely unused due to legal and ethical concerns about basing criminal prosecutions on evidence obtained through supernatural means. The intelligence gathered through possessed suspects continues to provide investigative leads that can be pursued through conventional methods, but the supernatural source of the information creates complications that challenge normal criminal justice procedures. For Rodriguez, the transition away from supernatural criminal investigation has allowed him to continue serving victims and their families while protecting his mental health from further exposure to paranormal phenomena that had caused severe psychological trauma. His experience has shown that the boundary between normal criminal investigation and supernatural intelligence gathering may be more permeable than conventional understanding suggests, but that crossing that boundary carries psychological risks that require careful consideration and adequate support for personnel who encounter paranormal activity during their duties. The ongoing mystery of why deceased criminals are able to confess through living prisoners remains unsolved. But Rodriguez's experience has contributed to growing awareness within law enforcement that some criminal investigations may involve supernatural elements that require acknowledgement and management, rather than denial or dismissal. His case has demonstrated that the psychological costs of supernatural criminal investigation may outweigh the benefits, even when the paranormal intelligence could potentially solve numerous cases and bring justice to victims who have waited decades for resolution. The detention center where Rodriguez conducted his supernatural interrogations continues to experience paranormal activity, with current staff reporting occasional incidents where prisoners provide information about crimes they couldn't possibly have known about through normal means. Whether these continuing supernatural manifestations represent ongoing attempts by deceased criminals to confess their crimes, or simply residual effects of the intense paranormal activity that Rodriguez experienced, remains unclear, but the phenomenon serves as a permanent reminder of the psychological dangers associated with supernatural criminal investigation, and the importance of protecting law enforcement personnel from paranormal exposures that can cause lasting psychological harm. The interview room, where Rodriguez conducted his supernatural interrogations, has been converted to storage use and is no longer used for prisoner interviews, but security personnel continue to report unusual activities in the area during overnight hours. The sealed room serves as a monument to the psychological costs of supernatural criminal investigation and the importance of recognizing that some forms of criminal intelligence may be too dangerous for human investigators to obtain safely, regardless of their potential value for solving crimes and achieving justice for victims and their families. Officer Jake Morrison had been driving the same patrol route through the industrial district of Camden, New Jersey, for 6 weeks when he first noticed the discrepancy. It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning, a building that seemed to be in a different location than he remembered. But Jake had an exceptional memory for spatial details, a skill that had made him valuable for surveillance work and crime scene documentation. The building in question was a defunct textile factory on Warehouse Row, a street lined with abandoned industrial structures that had been empty since the economic downturn of 2008. Jake was certain the factory had been the third building from the corner, but on the night of October 12, 2023, it appeared to be the fourth building from the corner. Probably just tired,
he told himself, making a mental note to get more sleep. Night shift work had a way of playing tricks with perception, and Jake had been putting in overtime to cover for colleagues who were out sick. But 3 nights later, the building had moved again. Now it was the second building from the corner, and Jake was certain he wasn't imagining it. He parked his patrol car and walked the length of Warehouse Row, counting buildings and checking addresses. The numbers didn't match his memory or the street directory in his patrol car. "Unit 15, this is dispatch. What's your status?" Jake hesitated before responding. "How do you report that buildings are moving around without sounding mentally unstable?" "Unit 15, I'm conducting a welfare check on Warehouse Row. All quiet here." "Copy that, Unit 15. Jake photographed each building with his phone, making detailed notes about their positions and conditions. When he returned to the station at the end of his shift, he compared his photos to Street View images on Google Maps. The discrepancies were undeniable. Buildings that appeared in his photos didn't match their locations in the online images. Maybe the Google images are old, he reasoned, but the metadata showed they had been updated within the past year. Jake decided to document the phenomenon more systematically. Over the next week, he photographed Warehouse Row every night, always from the same position and angle. The results were impossible to dismiss. The buildings were moving. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to casual observation, but consistently and measurably. The defunct textile factory wasn't the only structure changing position. A 3-story brick warehouse would shift closer to or farther from the street. An old loading dock would appear on the north side of a building one night and the south side the next. The changes were subtle but consistent, as if the entire street was slowly rearranging itself. Jake's attempts to discuss the phenomenon with his partner, Officer Maria Santos, were met with polite skepticism. "Buildings don't move, Jake. Maybe you're looking at them from different angles, or the lighting is creating optical illusions." But Jake had been careful to photograph from the exact same position each night, using landmarks to ensure consistency. The evidence was clear, even if the explanation was beyond anything in his experience. On the night of October 25th, Jake decided to park on Warehouse Row and observe the buildings directly rather than just driving past. He positioned his patrol car at the end of the street with a clear view of all the structures and settled in to watch. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual occurred. The buildings remained in their expected positions, dark and silent against the orange glow of the industrial district's security lighting. Jake was beginning to question his own observations when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the buildings, a 4-story structure that housed an abandoned printing company, appeared to be breathing. The walls were expanding and contracting slightly, like a massive chest rising and falling with slow, deep respirations. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked again. The movement was subtle but undeniable. The building was definitely moving, its brick facade rippling with an organic rhythm that defied every law of physics and architecture he understood. He grabbed his radio to call for backup, then hesitated. How do you report that a building is breathing without triggering a mandatory psychological evaluation? Jake decided to document the phenomenon first, then decide how to proceed. He activated his patrol car's dash camera and got out to position himself for the best view. Through the camera's LCD screen, he could see the movement clearly. The building's walls were definitely expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern. As Jake watched, other buildings on the street began to exhibit similar behavior. The textile factory's windows seemed to dilate and contract like pupils adjusting to light. A warehouse at the far end of the street appeared to be swaying slightly, as if moved by a wind that Jake couldn't feel. The most disturbing sight was the loading dock that had been changing positions. As Jake watched through his camera, it slowly slid from the north side of the building to the east side, moving like a massive tongue exploring the exterior wall. Jake's radio crackled. Unit 15, respond to a possible break-in at 1247 Industrial Boulevard. Silent alarm triggered. The address was only 3 blocks from his location, but Jake hesitated to leave. What he was witnessing seemed more significant than a routine burglary call, but he couldn't abandon his duties based on something he couldn't explain or prove. Unit 15, en route to 1247 Industrial. He drove to the reported break-in, conducted a thorough search of the property, and found no signs of forced entry or suspicious activity. The building's owner confirmed that the alarm system had been malfunctioning recently, triggering false alarms at irregular intervals. When Jake returned to Warehouse Row an hour later, the buildings had returned to their normal static appearance. But his dash camera had continued recording, and the footage showed the structures moving throughout his absence. Jake reviewed the footage frame by frame, documenting the subtle but unmistakable changes in the building's positions and shapes. The evidence was irrefutable, but the implications were staggering. Buildings don't move, walls don't breathe, and loading docks don't migrate around structures like living appendages. The next day, Jake researched the history of Warehouse Row and made a discovery that sent chills down his spine. The entire street had been built on the site of Camden's original city morgue, which had been demolished in 1962 after serving the community for over 70 years. The morgue had been larger than initially realized, extending far underground with sub-basements that had housed refrigeration units and storage areas. When the building was demolished, the underground levels had been sealed rather than excavated, leaving a vast network of rooms and corridors beneath the current street. Jake found newspaper articles from 1963 describing problems with the construction of the industrial buildings. Several structures had experienced foundation issues, requiring extensive reinforcement to prevent settling. Workers had reported unusual sounds coming from beneath the construction sites, sounds described as moaning and shuffling that occurred primarily at night. One article, buried in the back pages of the Camden Courier, mentioned that construction had been delayed after workers refused to continue working on the evening shift. They claimed to have seen lights moving in the sealed underground areas and to have heard what sounded like voices calling from beneath the construction sites. "It's like something down there doesn't want to stay buried," one worker was quoted as saying. "The concrete we pour during the day cracks overnight, and sometimes we find handprints in the cement that weren't there when we left." The construction company had eventually completed the project using only day shift workers, but several buildings had required multiple attempts to establish stable foundations. The final structures were built with unusually deep foundation systems that extended well below the original morgue levels. Armed with this historical context, Jake began to develop a theory about what he was witnessing. The buildings on Warehouse Row weren't moving. They were settling and shifting as the underground structure beneath them continued to change. The sealed morgue levels might be experiencing some form of ongoing structural failure that was affecting the buildings above. But that theory didn't explain the breathing walls or the migrating loading dock. No amount of foundation settling could account for the organic movements he had documented on his dash camera. Jake decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. He researched property records, building permits, and geological surveys for the entire Warehouse Row area. What he discovered was more disturbing than he had anticipated. The buildings on Warehouse Row had been experiencing structural problems for decades. Foundation repairs, wall reinforcements, and roof replacements were documented with unusual frequency. But most concerning was a pattern in the maintenance records. Repairs were consistently needed after periods when workers reported unusual activity in the buildings. Unusual activity was never clearly defined in the records, but it consistently involved sounds, movements, and atmospheric changes that couldn't be attributed to normal structural settling or environmental factors. Jake found insurance claims dating back to the 1970s for damage that was described as unexplained structural failures. Windows would crack in geometric patterns, walls would develop stress fractures overnight, and electrical systems would malfunction in ways that suggested interference from unknown sources. One particularly detailed report from 1987 described an incident where security guards had observed one of the buildings reshaping itself over the course of a single night. The guard's testimony was supported by photographs showing significant changes in the building's exterior configuration, but the insurance company had ultimately attributed the incident to a hoax or misidentification. Jake realized he needed to examine the buildings more closely. He began conducting more thorough patrols of Warehouse Row, parking for extended periods and documenting any unusual activity. His efforts were rewarded with increasingly clear evidence of the phenomenon he had been witnessing. The buildings were definitely moving, but not in ways that suggested structural failure. The movements were coordinated and purposeful, as if the structures were being manipulated by an intelligence that understood their construction and limitations. On the night of November 8th, Jake witnessed something that convinced him the phenomenon was not natural. He was parked at his usual observation point when he saw a man walking down Warehouse Row, approaching the textile factory that had been changing positions. The man appeared to be in his 60s, wearing work clothes and carrying what looked like architectural drawings. He walked directly to the textile factory and began examining its exterior walls, consulting his drawings and making notes on a clipboard. Jake got out of his patrol car and approached the man. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Officer Morrison with the Camden Police. Can I ask what you're doing here?" The man looked up from his drawings, and Jake was struck by his eyes. They were a pale blue color that seemed almost luminescent in the dim lighting. "I'm conducting a structural assessment," the man replied. "These buildings require regular adjustment to maintain stability." "Adjustment? What kind of adjustment?" The man gestured toward the textile factory. "The foundation systems here are more complex than they appear. The buildings need to be repositioned periodically to maintain proper alignment with the underground structure." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The man was talking about moving buildings as if it were a routine maintenance procedure. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. Do you have permission to be on this property?" The man smiled, and Jake noticed that his teeth appeared to be made of some kind of metal, not dental work, but actual metallic teeth that gleamed in the streetlight. "Officer Morrison, I've been maintaining these buildings longer than you've been alive. I understand your concern, but this work must continue." "How do you know my name?" "The same way I know about your photographs and your research into the history of this area. You've been documenting our work quite thoroughly." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. The conversation had taken a turn that suggested the man knew far more about Jake's activities than any random person should. "Sir, I need you to come with me for questioning." The man consulted his drawings again, then looked up at the textile factory. "I'm afraid that's not possible tonight. We have a significant realignment scheduled, and my presence is required." As if responding to his words, the textile factory began to move. Not the subtle breathing motion Jake had observed before, but a clear, deliberate shift as the entire structure rotated slowly on its foundation. Jake watched in stunned silence as the building turned approximately 15 degrees, its new position aligning with some pattern or design that only the man with the metallic teeth seemed to understand. "The underground chambers require specific configurations to maintain proper ventilation," the man explained, as if moving buildings were the most natural thing in the world. The original architects understood this, but their plans were lost during the demolition in 1962. "What underground chambers? The morgue was sealed decades ago." The man's smile widened, revealing more of those disturbing metallic teeth. "Officer Morrison, the morgue was never sealed. It was expanded. The city of Camden sits on a foundation far more complex than your municipal records indicate." Jake grabbed his radio to call for backup, but the device produced only static. He tried his cell phone with the same result. No signal, despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. "Communication difficulties are common during realignment procedures," the man observed. The electromagnetic fields generated by the repositioning process tend to interfere with electronic devices. Jake watched as two more buildings on Warehouse Row began to move, rotating and shifting like massive pieces in some incomprehensible puzzle. The loading dock he had seen migrating between buildings detached completely from its current structure and moved across the street to attach itself to a different warehouse. "This is impossible," Jake whispered. "Not impossible, Officer Morrison. Simply beyond the scope of what most people are prepared to accept. The buildings on Warehouse Row are not fixed structures. They are components in a larger system that extends far beneath the surface of your city." The man rolled up his architectural drawings and tucked them under his arm. "Your documentation of our activities has been noted and appreciated. However, we must ask that you discontinue your surveillance. The work we do here is essential, but must remain unobserved." "What work? What is this system you're talking about?" The man gestured toward the ground beneath their feet. "Camden was built on a foundation of death, Officer Morrison. Thousands of people passed through the original morgue over the decades it operated. Their remains were processed, stored, and eventually interred, but their presence left an imprint on the physical structure of this area." Jake felt his rational mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "You're talking about ghosts?" "Not ghosts, Officer Morrison. Architecture. The buildings above ground are connected to the chambers below by more than just physical foundations. The structures must be regularly adjusted to maintain proper balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead." As if to demonstrate his point, the man gestured toward the textile factory, which had completed its rotation and was now settling into its new position. The building's windows began to glow with a soft, pale light that seemed to come from within the structure itself. "The realignment allows proper energy flow between the levels," the man continued. "Without regular adjustment, the boundary between the worlds becomes unstable, and that instability manifests as structural problems in the buildings above." Jake stared at the glowing windows of the textile factory. The light was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not electric illumination, but something that seemed to have its own organic quality. "Who are you?" Jake asked. "I am the architect responsible for maintaining this system. I have been performing this function since the original morgue was constructed in 1891. The implications of that statement were staggering. If the man was telling the truth, he had been alive for over 130 years. But looking at his pale blue eyes and metallic teeth, Jake found himself believing something that defied every rational explanation. "The buildings will remain in their new positions for approximately 6 weeks," the man continued. "After that, another realignment will be necessary. We ask that you avoid documenting these procedures in the future." "And if I don't agree to that?" The man's expression became serious. "Officer Morrison, the work we do here is essential for maintaining the stability of your entire city. If the boundary between worlds becomes too unstable, the consequences would extend far beyond Warehouse Row." He pointed toward the downtown area visible in the distance. "Every building in Camden sits on the same foundation. If the underground chambers collapse or become misaligned, the entire city could experience what you might call supernatural flooding." Jake tried to imagine what supernatural flooding might mean and decided he didn't want to find out. "What do you want from me?" "Simply continue your regular patrols, but avoid extended observation of our activities. Report any structural problems you observe, but do not attempt to document or explain them. Some realities are too dangerous for official records." The man walked away, disappearing into the shadows between buildings with a fluidity that suggested he was more familiar with the darkness than any human should be. As he vanished, Jake's radio and cell phone suddenly regained their signals, crackling to life with accumulated messages from dispatch. Jake stood alone on Warehouse Row, surrounded by buildings that had returned to their normal, static appearance. but the textile factory's windows continued to glow with that strange, organic light, a reminder that what he had witnessed was real. Over the following weeks, Jake modified his patrol routine to spend less time on Warehouse Row. But he couldn't completely avoid the area, and he began to notice subtle signs that the underground system the man had described was more extensive than just the sealed morgue levels. Other streets in Camden showed similar anomalies: buildings that seemed to shift position slightly, structural changes that occurred overnight, and electrical disturbances that couldn't be explained by normal infrastructure problems. The phenomenon wasn't limited to Warehouse Row. It extended throughout the older sections of the city. Jake began to understand that Camden existed on two levels: the visible city above ground and the invisible city below. The buildings residents and workers saw every day were just the surface manifestation of a much larger and more complex structure that extended deep into the earth. The question that haunted him was whether other cities had similar systems, and whether police officers around the country were unknowingly patrolling above networks of underground chambers that required regular maintenance by individuals who might not be entirely human. Jake never saw the man with the metallic teeth again, but he continued to notice the effects of the realignment procedures. Every 6 weeks, the buildings on Warehouse Row would shift positions slightly, and the electrical systems throughout the industrial district would experience brief fluctuations that the power company attributed to normal grid maintenance. For Jake Morrison, the case represented a fundamental change in how he viewed his role as a police officer. He was no longer just patrolling the streets of Camden. He was unknowingly helping to maintain the boundary between two worlds, ensuring that the system that kept them separate continued to function properly. "Sometimes I wonder how many other officers have discovered what I discovered," he confided to his partner months later. "And I wonder how many of them were given the same choice I was: ignore what they've seen and continue their normal duties, or risk destabilizing something that's been keeping their city safe for over a century." The buildings on Warehouse Row continue their periodic realignments, watched over by an architect whose age and nature remain mysteries. And Officer Jake Morrison continues his patrols, carrying the knowledge that the city he has sworn to protect exists in a delicate balance between the world of the living and something far more complex and dangerous lurking beneath the streets.